Our American President series continues with a look at the nation's 11th president, James K. Polk. Earlier this year in our series, we visited the home of President Polk, located in Columbia, Tennessee, where we talked with historians William Seal and John Holtzapfel about Polk's career and his impact on the United States. The program's 2.5 hours and begins with a brief video biography. James Knox Polk was considered by many to have been a dark horse when he was nominated for president in 1844, despite his political resume. Polk had served as governor of Tennessee from 1839 to 1841. Before that, he had been a member of the U.S. House of Representatives for 14 years. He's still the only president to have served as Speaker of the House. Nevertheless, a newspaper reported many were astonished by the news of his nomination, and some even wondered if the newly invented telegraph wasn't broken. The opposition Whig Party campaign slogan became, "Who is Polk?" He was born November 2nd, 1795, in Mecklenburg County, North Carolina, but moved with his family to Tennessee by the age of 10. He graduated with honors from the University of North Carolina in 1818 and went on to study law. He was nicknamed Young Hickory because of his staunch support of Andrew Jackson, Polk the Plotter for the conscientiousness he showed while Speaker, and Napoleon of the Stump because of his short stature. His hair was straight and combed back off his face, and he had deep-set, penetrating gray eyes. He was said to have lacked charisma and a sense of humor. He was also uncomfortable in social situations. At White House functions, guests were rushed past the president, and an aide would repeat continuously, "Guests who have been presented will please walk into the East Room. Don't block up the passage." His moderate consumption of alcohol prompted an enemy to once say his problem was that he drank too much water. He married the intelligent and refined Sarah Childress when he was 28 and she was 20. She was said to have enjoyed her social duties when Polk was a congressman, and even more so when he was elected president. A devout Presbyterian, she banned dancing and hard liquor at official White House functions. She was the first to host the now annual Thanksgiving dinner at the White House. She offered her husband advice on public policy and often highlighted newspaper articles for him to read. His inauguration took place on a rainy March 4th, 1845. His vice president was George Mifflin Dallas, after whom Dallas, Texas was named. The catchphrase most closely associated with Polk is "Manifest Destiny," the push to expand the country westward. Following the Mexican War in 1848, the United States gained over 500,000 square miles of new territory. Polk was in a continual state of poor health. At age 17, he successfully had surgery without the aid of antiseptics or anesthesia. He was plagued with stomach problems for the majority of his life. When his term ended, Polk retired. He wrote in his diary, "I feel exceedingly relieved that I am now free from all public cares. I am sure I'll be a happier man in my retirement than I have been during the 4 years I have filled the highest office in the gift of my countrymen." Following Zachary Taylor's inauguration, Polk embarked on a 1-month tour of the South. He fell ill during this time and died on June 15, 1849, 3 months after returning to Polk Place in Tennessee. He was 53.
Welcome to the 11th of our 41 programs on American presidents. You're looking at the home of President James K. Polk's parents in Columbia, Tennessee, about 50 minutes south of the Nashville, Tennessee airport, a town of 35,000 people, just 6 miles from the Spring Hill Saturn automobile plant. As a young man, James Polk lived in this home for about 6 months prior to his marriage, and it was the only home connected with President Polk still in existence. Our guests for the next 2.5 hours will include William Seal, author and historian, John Holtzapfel, director of the James K. Polk Home, and Thomas Price, curator of collections, also at the James K. Polk Home. Got some telephone numbers to give you. Once you get you involved right away. We've got historians from all over the United States who have joined us in this series and add a lot to the program, and you can begin dialing now. There are lines open to call on 202-624-1111 if you live in the Eastern and Central time zone, 202-624-1115 if you live in the Mountain and Pacific time zone. Dr. Seal, where are we?
Well, we're in Columbia, Tennessee, in the home of James K. Polk's parents. And the house is a museum today, used as a place to assemble the Polk's memorabilia, which is quite extensive, of the properties and things they bought in the White House and after they left the White House to go into retirement. The furniture, the paintings, the chandeliers, and all such things intended for their house in Nashville, Polk Place, which was ultimately demolished. And this collection then was brought here.
You know, one of the first things you notice when you come into this home, and we've been here now for a couple of days steeped in Polkisms, is right back over here are two portraits. And tell us about that.
Well, they're both by Healy. This one is when he went in the White House, when he was first president. And the other one is after he left. You can see how much he aged in the trials of the job. And if you read his diary, edited by Alan Nevins long ago, Diary of a President, you can see how hard he worked. He was just all business.
Well, let's go back just one more time, because
Okay.
you said the first one he's 50 years old, and the second one he's about 53 years old.
53, yeah, 49 and 53.
What did he do as president that gave him all those gray hairs, and that he died 3 months after he left?
Well, he died of cholera, probably. The White House was not a nice place to stay in the summer because of the swamps to the south. And presidents never stayed there. This was the first one to spend the whole summer in the White House. And the fear was cholera. And so he probably had that. Anyway, he was buried very, very quickly after he died, as though he did have cholera, which the law prescribed. But he worked hard, very, very hard every day. His diary reveals this. He was a politician. He had his thumb on his cabinet. They did what he said. If they didn't, like George Bancroft, the historian, they resigned and went somewhere else. He had specified what he wanted to accomplish, and he accomplished it in his time in office, and died 3 months later.
Worcester, Massachusetts, you're our first caller. Go ahead, please. You're on with Dr. Seal.
Good morning, Dr. Seal. I think you kind of stole my thunder on the question. I was wondering, I remember studying back in elementary school about he being the only president that really accomplished his promises. Could you kind of outline what the promises were and how he accomplished them?
Well, the main promises were in expansion. He said in his inaugural address that America, by right, owned Oregon, which we were sharing occupation of with England. It was an unresolved problem. He said we owned it. He said the annexation of Texas was none of Mexico's business. And of course, 2 days later, the Mexican minister was withdrawn and returned to Mexico over that, cut off relations. These were the main things, were the territorial ambitions, which he did achieve.
Born right outside of Charlotte, North Carolina, how did he get here?
He got here with his family. His father, Samuel, his mother, Jane. They were pioneers. It was a pioneer family, as a matter of fact. It started out in Ireland, went to Scotch-Irish. They went to Maryland, then Pennsylvania, then North Carolina, and through the mountains at last to Tennessee, to this place, which was called the Duck River Valley, not Murray County then, or Columbus. And he was with his parents. They lived in log houses. They were land hungry. Part of that whole generation that land was everything. Land was money. They always had more land than they did money. And witness, in 1806, they moved to this area from North Carolina, and 10 years later occupied this house, a large brick house, which was really civilization for that time, for 1816, when this house was finished. And of course, 2 years later, he went to University of North Carolina to school, and then came back here and lived before his marriage. But it was a pioneer family, and he came here with his parents.
Amelia, Ohio, next up. Go ahead, please. You're on with Dr. Seal.
Yes, sir. I'm in the county I live in. It's called Claremont County. Cincinnati's just due west of us. When Polk was elected president, I know he was a vast in the minority. He wasn't expected to win. And much credit, I think, is given to the Liberty Party of James Burney and Thomas Morris. I was wondering if the gentleman could tell me if he could give me some information on if he gives credit to the Liberty Party. Both of those gentlemen lived here in Claremont County at one time, and it was quite an upset prior to his election. The Liberty Party had only picked up about 6,000 votes at any one national election, and then in the election of 1844 picked up close to 70,000 votes. So I just
was that the difference? Thanks, I mean, was that
Whig
the difference?
votes. I mean, right, it was Whig votes. They split the vote. Is what split the opponent vote.
And James Polk was a Democrat.
Polk walked away with it. Yeah.
Had that Liberty Party not been in there, would he have been defeated?
I don't think so. I think he was a winner. It would have been probably a slim. It was slim, but it probably would have been. I can't tend to think he would have won. There was a lot of support for expansionism at that time. The Texas issue was right on the fence, hanging fire. And Texas was courting England, after all, or England was courting Texas for a protectorate, which would have been terrible. It would have put the British on our soil in a time when the Monroe Doctrine was sort of laughed at abroad. And it was an issue, this whole Texas thing. Even people who didn't want it. Then, of course, the slavery issue of expanding slavery into Texas created a tremendous opposition in the East. But I think the expansion issue would have carried him.
William Seals from Beaumont, Texas originally. He has a PhD from Duke University. He's written a lot of books about the White House. We've got a couple of them here. When did you first get interested in James Polk?
Oh, goodness, I've always been interested in westward expansion and being from Texas and all, and probably when I was born. I don't know. I've always been interested in him and in his period.
We'll show you his birthplace area as it is today after we take this call from Rochester, Minnesota. Go ahead, please.
Hi, my name is Sean Kettlecamp, and I met Dr. Seal at the White House Symposium. And the question I have is kind of a little ahead of the program, I think, but I was wondering if the Polk Museum there had any furniture that they may have used in the White House, and also they had such sumptuous White House china, President Polk. I was just wondering if any of that was represented there at his home.
It is. Yes, it is. There's china. There's the china they used in their private area, the small dining room on the main floor. Then there are pieces of the big set that you'll remember they bought. But most of these things that are here are what they bought to take into retirement with them, which obviously was a fancier sort of thing than they had owned before. And I'd like to say, in connection with talking about their possessions, the Polks envisioned their home. They bought a big house, bigger than anything they'd ever lived in, and they were just the two of them. They were childless in Nashville, with the idea that it would be a museum of their administration in their time. Polk sensed very strongly what he had achieved, the expansion and so forth, and they wanted a Polk place to be a hermitage, or and a hermitage, you know, only shortly after his death actually went into public hands, and it wasn't to be. It was ultimately torn down. There was a big estate battle of relatives, and ultimately the house was torn down. So these things came here.
If you've just joined us, we're in Columbia, Tennessee. It's a very easy place to get to. You get on I-65, come on down and get on Route 31. And Spring Hill, as we mentioned, is right there where the Saturn plant, only about 6-7 miles from here. Small town of about 35,000 people. You can see the map there on the screen. We're talking about James Polk, our 11th president, but there's a church over here that says he was the 10th president, which we'll find out why as the program goes on. Burlington, North Carolina, for William Seal. Good morning.
Good morning, gentlemen. It's a pleasure to be on this program with you. I have a literary footnote for you about the election of 1844. A young New York Tammany Democrat named Gansert Melville began doing stump speeches for Polk. He helped rally the Van Buren supporters in New York State behind Polk. He did speeches all over, stump speeches all over the West, and visited in Columbia, I believe, with Polk and with Andrew Johnson. He was the one who came up with the nickname Young Hickory, as Polk being a twig off Old Hickory. And when he was given a commemorative banner by the ladies of Tennessee, which he proudly carried in the pre-election torchlight parade through New York City, right before the election, and as a result of Polk winning, he appointed young Gansford Melville as secretary to the American legation in London. And when he went over, he carried with him the unpublished manuscript of his sailor boy brother, Herman Melville. And Typee was published in London and started the literary career of Herman Melville, and he became my first literary sex symbol. So thank you, gentlemen, very much.
Hey, thanks a lot for that call. We have a camera outside here. It's way up on a big stick, a little tiny camera that shows the courtyard here. You can see it on your screen. The sun's coming up right actually in front of that. What are you looking at on this picture?
Well, you're looking at the house on your left, facing the corner that it's on one of the main streets of Columbia, and then you have the back area, courtyard area, which may have been chicken yards, but it's fixed very nicely now as a garden. A very pleasant place to be, with a fountain that was originally at Polk Place. This is a garden, sort of a memorial garden to Polk and the various people who've worked hard on this to keep this restoration going, to the rear of where we are.
We have a call from Old Bridge, New Jersey. Good morning. You're on the air.
Good morning. I wanted to ask your guest, presidential historians such as Thomas Bailey and Arthur Schlesinger Jr. Represent Polk as being a above average to near great president, largely because he's the only president of that era to really fully accomplish his agenda. And I was just curious if you would comment on Polk's accomplishment of his agenda during the 4 years that he was president, with reference to his relationship with the Whigs in Congress and the election of and then the election of the President Taylor in 1848, which swept the Whigs into power.
Polk totally controlled Congress. It was a Democratic Congress when he went in. In the elections of '47, the Whigs made great advances and great changes, and it became more difficult for him at the time. He was a good maneuverer. He had been a congressman, he had been Speaker of the House, and he was a good maneuverer. But he decided, for reasons unknown, to continue his old idea of himself not running again, and already had announced it by the end of '47. So he wasn't much of a player in the election that followed. In terms of his achievements, I think that the expansion is probably the main thing. Also, the wish to return to a federal-based banking system. He also did small things that were very important. He put the government on the voucher system. He made a lot more convenient government, bookkeeping-wise. He put the bookkeeping right. He established the first private secretary to the president. He created what you might call today a secretarial pool that interacted with the cabinet and all. He made the government more efficient.
Let's show some of the video from his Pineville home, where you can visit today. There's a little museum there. Have you ever been there?
You mean in Charlotte?
In North Carolina, right outside? It's in Mecklenburg County. You can see there a stone that says that this is where he lived and was born, and you see some cabins on the property where he did not live, and they were not the same cabins. They've been rebuilt since then. What do you think the advantage is to folks when they rebuild old homes and say this was a replica of what it looked like? Do you like the idea yourself?
It doesn't bother me particularly. If it's, this is very generic, you know, they don't know what this house looked like at all. But it's the sort of thing that probably of his financial status and so forth that he might have had. It gives people something to see, something to trigger the imagination.
Was he married?
Who? Polk?
James Polk, yeah.
Not by that time.
No, but I mean, was he married at all?
Oh, yes, of course. He married Sarah Childress.
When did he marry?
1820.
And what was the difference in their age?
8 years, about.
Did they have children?
No, never had children.
Tell them, New Hampshire, you're next with Bill Seal. Go ahead, please.
Yes, part of, if I'm not mistaken, part of Polk's campaign promise was westward expansion as part of the Manifest Destiny. After he failed to acquire more land in Oregon with the British, the 5440 or fight slogan, do you think he was all but forced to go to war with Mexico in the hope of acquiring more land?
But he did. The Oregon question was pretty well settled. No, the Mexican issue started immediately after his inauguration. He from what he said in his inaugural address, that Mexico cut off relations with the United States. And Taylor, General Taylor, was sent from Baton Rouge, where his headquarters were, immediately to Corpus Christi in Texas, at the Nueces River, to be there on the edge of the disputed boundary. The United States claimed the Rio Grande. Then Taylor was sent to the Rio Grande and then invaded Mexico after months within the next year. So the war started, I mean, the roll toward the war started immediately, and Oregon went on at the same time.
How many people in the United States in 1844 during that election?
20 million. You mean population?
Yes.
Around 20 million, I remember.
And how many states were there?
30.
And during the time that he was president, what was the expansion in the number of states?
We added 3 states.
And those were?
Wisconsin, Iowa, and what was the other one?
Illinois? No.
Texas.
Texas. Yeah. We had a little quiz here. They have on the website, by the way. Those of you who have access to it, the Polk Home here has a website in which they ask you. There's a quiz. It's fun to do. We did it. Dr. Seal passed it. I failed it. Where I can't find the website now. I'll find it in just a second. The address. It's www.jameskpolk, all in small letters, .com, and you can play the same quiz. We have a call from Reston, Virginia next. Go ahead, please.
I had a question about James Polk. I'm watching your show. Was he a good student when he was in school?
Well, I only know that he graduated ahead of his class at University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill.
Caller, how old are you?
7.
7 years old. And are you interested in presidents?
Yes.
When did you get interested?
This year in school.
Do you have a favorite president?
Yes.
Who's that?
Abraham Lincoln.
And why is that?
Because he sent a letter that the slaves, that he wanted the slave traders to free the slaves.
Can you remember, Dr. Seal, when you first...
The first time he did that was actually during Polk's administration, when he went in later in the Mexican War. Lincoln was in Congress, and he worked out a program for freeing slaves in the District of Columbia because it was such a major slave trading center. He did. He came out with a program for that long before this other that led him to such fame in the climactic period of American history.
C-SPAN in the Classroom is an organization that is prepared to help you out if you are a teacher. And the number is on the screen, 202-626-4858. We like to give it out during all these programs. You can dial it up and get materials that you can use this fall in your classes, or if you happen to have a summer school. And we'll keep you informed as the year goes on through our website and other ways about activities surrounding our series on presidents. If you've just joined us, we're in Columbia, Tennessee. We're talking about the 11th President of the United States, James K. Polk, a Democrat, served 4 years. When he was elected in 1844, what were the circumstances in the country?
Well, there was brooding unrest, but a great feeling. As I mentioned earlier, the Texas issue was hovering, whether to take Texas. The United States had declined to take Texas originally after the Texas Revolution in 1836 because of the slavery issue, or the issue of expanding slavery, because Texas was a slave culture. So the Republic of Texas lived on these years and a decade, and there was the issue of taking it on, still being debated pretty hotly, and the desire for land. I mean, it was just the desire for land. I think this was, but the issues that were ultimately to lead to the Civil War are on that path. We're very much in evidence already.
Spokane, Washington, for William Seal. Go ahead, please.
Good morning, gentlemen. Dr. Seal,
Hi.
could you comment, please, on the level of security in the White House during President Polk's administration? How approachable would he have been?
Very. You would be shocked at how approachable he would be. In the previous administration, President Tyler had founded Washington's Metropolitan Police Force, which still exists, of course, and it was founded really as an auxiliary protection agency for the White House. So you had men in business suits, never uniforms at the White House. Business suits are never military uniforms. Business suits in the entrance hall, who would later be called ushers. All of them carried pistols. And but getting in the house was not difficult, getting in the grounds, and there were efforts at break-ins from time to time. But there was no all-night real security. There was a guard upstairs in the hall, and that's about it.
Peachland, North Carolina, you're next.
Good morning.
Hi.
There's always been a friendly controversy over where he was actually born at, between North Carolina and South Carolina. Is it recognized in your museum that he actually was born in North Carolina? Because there were some disputes on the actual border of North and South Carolina in those days and where he was born.
You know, I think you're thinking about Andrew Jackson in the Waxhaws in South Carolina as to whether he was born, which both states claim him, but by letter he claimed South Carolina was where he was born.
And by the way, I was on the way down yesterday, I stopped over at the Hermitage, Andrew Jackson's home up in Tennessee, up in Nashville, and they have a timeline there, and they say Andrew Jackson was born the Waxhaws, South Carolina.
Well.
And then when I got down here, and over right next door in the little museum over there, there's a timeline that says Andrew Jackson, born Waxhaw, North Carolina. So you can get it in the same state, only 50 minutes apart. Next call, we go to Downingtown, Pennsylvania for William Seal. Go ahead, please.
Yes, Brian, thank you for C-SPAN. I had some questions regarding the death of President Polk. I'm not a historian, and I've basically gotten interested in presidents from your series. There was mention that he died of cholera. And my question is that, from what I remember from yesterday's program, President Polk had a long-term problem with some kind of stomach ailment. Right. And I wonder what the diagnoses of those days were, whether they would have been able to diagnose an ulcer. And if he had a chronic ulcer for any length of time, would he have died from something like stomach cancer as opposed to cholera? I'll just wait for your answer.
Well, it's interesting. It could be. It could be, but they didn't know. When he was young, he underwent an operation for the equivalent of kidney stones without any painkiller other than brandy or whiskey, and he always had kidney trouble. He had almost perpetual diarrhea as president, and one of the papers reported at the time that that's what he died of. We don't know, except cholera was a big problem in Washington, and his symptoms were of that. And as I said earlier, he was ordered, he had to be buried immediately to get the body out of the way. It was considered putrid, you know, and that's about all that's known. But he was a sick man when he left the White House, and that long trip wore him out. He was celebrated everywhere along the way. In a minute, we're going to meet John Holtapple, who Maura Pierce, who is our producer on this stop and also celebrating her 35th birthday today, says knows everything there is to know about James Polk. But if our camera is ready, I want to show you a timeline that they've established over in the museum next door, which kind of tells us what was going on in this country at that time, events and accomplishments. And this, as you walk through the museum, this is available to read, and we get a close-up there. We've talked about some of this, but we can run through a bunch of it just very quickly. The 27th star was added to the flag during his term of Florida, July 4th, 1845. Naval Academy opened at Annapolis. Texas became the 28th state. Uniform Election Day was established in 1846. War declared against Mexico in May of 1846. First known baseball game played under the rules established by Alex Cartwright of Elysian Fields, Hoboken, New Jersey, June 19th, 1846. Treaty concluded with Great Britain establishing the Oregon boundary. Independent Treasury Act approved. Smithsonian Institution created, 1846. The building. We learned earlier that John Quincy Adams was very much involved in all that. Elias Howe patents the sewing machine. The rotary printing press was invented. Treaty signed with with Grenada. Colombia granting U.S. right-of-way across the Isthmus of Panama. Now we're about ready to give that up. Beginning 50 years of controversy over what to do about it, yes. Iowa became the 29th state. The postage stamp was authorized by act of Congress, and we'll show you that with Ben Franklin's 5-cent stamp there on the wall in a minute. Congress provided for gas lighting of the Capitol. The White House the next year. An advanced party of Mormons entered the valley of the Great Salt Lake. Gold was discovered in California. A treaty signed with Mexico February the 2nd, 1848.
And then there's one more list. Wisconsin became the 30th state. Cornerstone of the Washington Monument was laid in 1848. Was he there?
Yes.
First Women's Rights Convention at Seneca Falls. Territorial Government of Oregon established in August of 1848. Department of Interior created 1849. Coinage of the gold and double eagle, dollar and double eagle. And the fabulous 40s, Emerson, Thoreau, Hawthorne, Longfellow, Whittier, Lowell, Powell, and Cooper produced the golden age of American letters. A lot of those folks are buried in Concord, Massachusetts. And now to John Holtzapfel. John Holtzapfel, tell us about this place. You've run it for what, the last 15 years?
That's right.
Where are you?
I'm in the upstairs study where Polk home visitors can see original furnishings from James K. Polk's first law office here in Columbia. The office itself, which is no longer standing, was a gift from his father. His father, Samuel, a prominent land surveyor, was so delighted that this rather frail, unpromising oldest son had become an attorney that Samuel built James a law office and bought him $140 worth of law books to get started. James promptly thanked his father because Samuel, the father, was arrested for a fray, for fighting in downtown Columbia. And with his oldest son as his attorney, Samuel was fined just $1, while the other person involved in the fight was fined $10. So an auspicious beginning for James K. Polk's legal career.
John Holtzapfel is a York, Pennsylvania native. He went to the University of Delaware, where he got a history degree, a bachelor's, and a history master's, what, Cooperstown graduate program?
Exactly right. A program connected with the New York State Historical Association and the State University of New York system that focuses on history museum studies.
Stay where you are, sir. We'll go to Portland, Oregon for our next call. Good morning. Go ahead, please.
Good morning. How are you?
Fine. Welcome.
I have a question for Dr. Seal. I understand, Doctor, that you're from Texas. Is that correct?
Yes.
When you study the issue with Polk in Mexico, did you study Mexican history and their side of the question in Texas?
It was one of my fields in graduate school. I'm very interested in Mexican history.
Good. I'm glad to hear that, because most people who talk about the Texas history know very little about the Mexican history. As you know, Mexico actually declared itself free of slaves in the 1824 Constitution. Is that correct?
Right, that's correct.
So the main question in Texas by the Anglo-Texans was that they wanted to remain with rights to slavery. That was one of the main issues. Isn't that correct?
It's true. Well, absolutely true.
Excuse me, I have somewhat of an ailment and I can't speak too clearly this morning. So how do you square the big disagreement between the slave state situation later on and the fact that that Mexico had already declared Texas free of slavery?
Well, the only justification they had was the Texas Revolution, which had broken any relationship with, theoretically, with the Republic of Mexico.
Yeah,
and
the same revolution question was between the states north and south. But
right.
The Texas history is always being presented as a revolution being an honorable revolution for other reasons other than the fact that the slavery situation was the main question.
Well, there was an entire emotional buildup of this, in a sense, to justify not only the removal of Texas from Mexico, which Mexico obviously owned, but the Mexican War itself. There were a variety of books to supposedly make Americans understand Mexico, which they didn't. You've given me an opportunity to bring up something I begged to bring up, and this is the memoir of the travel journal of Madame Calderon de la Barca. She was the Spanish lady. Well, actually, she wasn't. She was from Boston, married to the Spanish diplomat. And they lived in Mexico in 1839 and 40, and she wrote a book published in 42 which had a tremendous effect in the United States. It is one of the best accounts of Mexico in this period, description-wise. She was writing to her friend, Prescott, who wrote, as you know, the Conquest of Mexico. But listen to this sort of thing. She's visited Magna del Clavo, the estate of General Santa Anna. And this is after the Texas Revolution, a couple of years. In a little while entered the General Santa Anna himself, a gentlemanly, good-looking, quiet-dressed, rather melancholy-looking man with one leg, apparently a good deal of an invalid, and to us decidedly the best-looking and most interesting figure in the group. He has a sallow complexion, fine eyes, soft and penetrating, and an interesting expression of face. Knowing nothing of his past history, one would have said a philosopher living in dignified retirement, one who had tried the world and found that all was vanity, one who had suffered ingratitude, and who, if he were ever persuaded to emerge from his retreat, would only do so Cincinnatus-like to benefit his country. It is strange, and a fact worthy of notice in a natural history like mine, how frequently this expression of philosophic resignation, of placid sadness, is to be remarked on the countenance of the most cunning, deepest, most ambitious, most designing, and most dangerous statesman I've ever seen. So it's a wonderful book of description, but it's filled with all of that negative attitude about Mexicans in Mexico. And you know that there's the great desert between San Luis Potosí and up into Texas. There's a kind of a river between the two. And you had a lot of things like that. You had in 1843, Prescott's Conquest of Mexico came out, one of the most dramatically written books. But Americans had a mental picture of Mexico and as being negative, of a place that couldn't control itself, couldn't run itself since independence in 21. And Sam Houston, one of the big characters of this period, speaks at this time of Americans prattling about slavery when we should go liberate Mexico, where people who were born free were held in shackles. It was a different thing, but they looked on Mexicans as slaves of a sort too.
If you've just joined us, we're in Columbia, Tennessee. We're talking about James K. Polk. Our guest, William Seal, here in the living room of this home, which is located on Route 412. You can see that from time to time from outside. And John Holtzapfel will be right back to you, Mr. Holtzapfel, after we grab this call from San Antonio, Texas. Go ahead, please.
There's been a lot of rumblings from Mexicans and also Mexican Americans in this area that Texas was practically stolen from Mexico and also the western states, because Polk actually literally planned and forced the war with Mexico deliberately in order to have an opportunity to do so. What is your information regarding that idea?
Let me ask John Holtzapfel if he wants to jump in on this.
Okay, thank you, Brian. That indeed has been a long-standing controversy, whether the war was intentionally provoked. Historians will often look to another diplomatic achievement of James K. Polk, the Oregon Treaty with Great Britain, where Polk used bold demands and intimidation and brinkmanship to settle a treaty with Great Britain. And I believe often historians think that James K. Polk was trying to do the same with Mexico, that he indeed did not want a war. The United States wasn't ready for a war, but that he was engaged in some serious saber rattling. When James K. Polk had Zachary Taylor's troops march as far south as the Rio Grande, Polk was accepting the Texans' claim that Texas stretched to the Rio Grande. Mexico, on the other hand, first of all, never recognized the independent Republic of Texas. They claimed that when Texas became a U.S. state, the United States had just stolen a Mexican province. To add salt into the wound, Mexico had traditionally seen the Texas border as an oasis river, which Dr. Seal alluded to before. So when U.S. troops marched as far as the Rio Grande, that was really provocative to Mexico.
John Holtzapfel, do you happen to know how many Americans were in the military back in those days?
I don't know the full number. I believe the number that Zachary Taylor had marched to the Rio Grande was around 4,000. So I mentioned before, rather serious saber rattling. Polk, of course, claimed that the American army was still on American territory, that he was in Texas. The Mexican government said that Taylor and his troops had crossed into Mexico. So Mexican troops attacked Taylor's group. Lives were lost on both sides. And in May of 1846, James K. Polk wrote a war message to Congress saying that American blood had been shed on the American soil. Of course, the Mexican government saw it totally differently.
The next president of the United States was Zachary Taylor. We will visit his home area where he's buried right now in Louisville, Kentucky on Monday, Memorial Day, and be at the Zachary Taylor National Cemetery. And we go next to Lincoln City, Oregon. You're on. Go ahead, please.
Yes, my name is Ross Smith, and I've recently been doing research on the migration over the Oregon Trail in the period of first 3 years of Polk's administration. And one of the things that you haven't mentioned is that more land was added to the United States during Polk's administration with the addition of Texas and Oregon Territory and the Southwest than at any other time in the history of the United States, including the original territories, original colonies and their territories.
At any one time, yes.
Now, you also mentioned, I've got two questions here. You mentioned that Polk accomplished all that he said he would was going to accomplish, but he had campaigned on the slogan of 54-40 or fight, and 54 degrees 40 minutes north latitude is the southern was the southern border of Russian Alaska. And it is said that Polk settled the boundary with British Columbia at 49 degrees north latitude so that he could get that issue resolved and would free him to carry on his greater objective, which was to add the Southwest to the United States. And as you know, that was accomplished 1 week after gold was discovered in California, and the message hadn't gotten around yet. So that window of opportunity was it turned out to be a rather short one. And the question that I really have here is, did Polk provoke the war with Mexico by sending Taylor on his excursion?
Certainly.
In order to, did he free the British Columbia issue in order to clear the deck, so to speak, to engage in this provocative war with Mexico to accomplish the greater mission of adding California and the Southwest?
Thanks,
and I'll hang up and listen to your answer to that.
I'm afraid I don't have much of an answer. I don't really know, except the circumstances would suggest that, perhaps.
John Holzapfel, do you?
Though a lot is made of that campaign slogan, 54-40 or fight, one has to remember that presidential candidates at that time didn't have the control over their campaigns that they tend to do now. A lot of Democrats, especially in northern states, were chanting 54-40 or fight, but Polk himself never really signed on to that pledge. He rather shrewdly, and some critics would say disingenuously, never disassociated himself from 54-40, but he had never made that his goal. In fact, in dealings with Great Britain, he probably used the threat of 54-40 to help Great Britain compromise on the 49th parallel. Whether or not the Oregon dispute was settled intentionally so that Polk could focus on the Southwest, the dispute with Oregon needed settled. He got the compromise that he wanted. Critics often have pointed out, though, that Polk seemed to be willing to compromise on northern territory rather than on southern territory. Different explanations for that. Thomas Hart Benton, a senator from Missouri at that time, thought that the United States didn't want to at all get involved with the war with Great Britain, so they were maybe more cautious in those dealings than they were with Mexico. Polk himself didn't think that the New Mexico Territory or California would ever support slavery, so Polk probably cannot be accused of intentionally adding or fighting for more slave territory, other than, of course, Texas, which was a slave state.
Let me get our guests here to help me recap. For those of you who have just joined us, we're talking about the 11th President of the United States, a man who married but didn't have any children, who died at age 53, some 3 months after he left office in 1849, who was succeeded in the presidency by Zachary Taylor. He was the only man ever to be Speaker of the House and President of the United States. He was a member of the Tennessee House of Representatives, 1823 to 1825. He was a 14-year veteran of the U.S. House of Representatives. He was governor of the state of Tennessee. And I'd like to ask John Holzapfel, why was it that when he ran for governor and won, he then lost the next 2 times?
Very frustrating situation to James K. Polk. For a long time, since Andrew Jackson's heydays, Tennessee had been a hotbed for the Democratic Party. But as time passed and Tennessee grew economically, the residents of this state began to like some of the Whig ideas more, like federally funded roads and bridges connecting Tennessee with the states across the mountains. So Tennessee, for that and other reasons, began to lean more toward Whigs. A part of the reason that James K. Polk even left Congress while Speaker of the House, he'd been Speaker for 2 terms, he came back to Tennessee to run for governor, partly because he thought he could rescue Tennessee for the Democratic Party. Unfortunately for him, after he won the one time, he wasn't able to stem the Whig tide. Also, unfortunately, in the 2 times he tried unsuccessfully to run for re-election, his opponent was a homespun candidate, sort of in the William Henry Harrison hard cider and log cabin mode, a man named Lean Jimmy Jones, who was a great storyteller and really popular with the crowd, and the rather serious-minded James K. Polk couldn't rescue Tennessee for the democracy, running against Lean Jimmy Jones.
We're in Columbia, Tennessee, and that's about 50 minutes south of Nashville on Route I-65. It's about 4 or 5 miles from where we are, I-65. And we go next to Nashville, Tennessee, which is our next caller. Go ahead, please.
Yes. I know Polk was kind of a states' rights in the Jeffersonian school. I wonder if you can comment on what his thoughts were on the more radical things like secession and nullification.
Thanks. William, sir?
Well, nullification, he had not supported. He was a supporter of Andrew Jackson in the 30s when nullification came out, and of course he didn't live till secession. So he took the Jacksonian line about that. Would have been very against secession, I suppose, by that time, though things had split up and all, but I can only comment on what he did in the 30s and 40s, and he supported the Jackson line of keeping the Union together, that there was no right to nullify.
Was he a slaveholder, by the way?
Oh, yes. He inherited slaves and purchased slaves. He owned an interest in a slave team down in Mississippi, which was one of his main financial investments was a cotton plantation in Mississippi, not far from Oxford, and he had slaves there, and he visited there every year to check on this investment, which Mrs. Polk very prudently sold right before the Civil War.
We go next to Cazenovia, New York. Go ahead, please.
My name is Dallas Bates Trammell, and one of my ancestors was George Mifflin Dallas, vice president with Polk. Can anyone comment as to the relationship between the two, Polk and Dallas?
John Holzapfel?
George Dallas was a Philadelphian, former mayor of Philadelphia, in fact, who strongly supported Texas annexation. When James K. Polk was the unexpected Democratic candidate in 1844, the Democrats needed to find some way to reach out to the Northeastern Democrats who were hoping that Martin Van Buren would be the candidate that year. So along with Polk, they wanted to find a Northeastern Democrat. After first inviting a Martin Van Buren loyalist, Silas Wright from New York, to be the vice president, George Mifflin Dallas was a good second choice. He was a Northeasterner, a Pennsylvanian, but strongly supported Polk's expansionist agenda.
If I could add, John, also, Dallas was less a politician than Polk. He was a diplomat. He was a distinguished diplomat. He had been minister to, we didn't have ambassadors, you know, till the 1890s. He was minister to Russia. He was at St. James in England. He was not always in the political fray. So he had a reputation, a very distinguished, a reputation for being a very distinguished, rather aloof man from the fight.
As a Texan, do you know when they named Dallas Dallas, and did they name it after this man?
Well, I guess when it was founded in the 1840s, late 1840s. It was named originally.
John Holzapfel, you are looking at some furniture up there, the law offices. Could you give us just a little bit more on that, and then show us the Sarah Childress room?
Okay, certainly. In this room, we have a secretary, a writing chair, and a bookcase that belonged to James K. Polk from his local law office.
Right here in town?
Exactly. He was based here in Columbia, but for a while he served as a circuit lawyer. He'd ride by horseback from one small county seat to the next, handling a wide variety of cases. His specialty was criminal defense, the same specialty of his legal mentor, Felix Grundy. But Polk, as a frontier lawyer, did a little of everything. Since he became so well known over a wide district, that really encouraged his political aspirations. And just 27 years old when he ran for a seat in the state legislature and won. The legislature at that time met in Murfreesboro, Tennessee, and that's where James met Sarah Childress, and that might be a good lead into the next room.
And as you walk to the next room, tell us how far Murfreesboro is from where we are here.
It's about 50 miles northeast of here.
And where are we now?
We're in a northeast bedroom here where we display furnishings and personal belongings of Sarah. She was a gracious, elegant lady, as evidenced by the gown and the fan. The fan has sort of a Mediterranean look. One of her nicknames in Washington was the Spanish Donna, which is a rather unexpected nickname for a Scotch-Irish Presbyterian from Murfreesboro.
Did she drink, by the way?
She did not allow hard liquor in the White House, but the Polks had a very extensive wine list and liqueur list, and I know Dr. Seal can speak to that. I think he's on a crusade to eradicate the false story that Sarah didn't permit alcohol in the White House.
Hold on just a second. Is that true?
It is. What happened in the White House was that in the early days, women didn't travel much with the senators and congressmen. Very few did. So the wives didn't. And so in the times before the War of 1812, when Madison was trying to build his constituency, the Madisons began entertaining 2 nights a week at the White House. Well, and a good way to get the men to come was to serve what we would call drinks. I mean, it was punch or grog or whatever that Dolly Madison served. It was hard whiskey mixed with fruit juice and stuff like that. Well, that had gone on forever in the White House, that hard drinking, and then wine at dinner. What the Polks did away with was the hard stuff. She wasn't temperance totally, but she didn't like the spirits. The wine was fine to sip with your food.
We're going to introduce you to Tom Price in a moment. John Holtzapfel, Sarah Childress lived how long after her husband died? He was at 53 when he died. How long did she live?
She outlived him by 42 years. She was just 45 years old when she became a widow. The Polks had just returned to that home in Nashville, Polk Place, that William Seal alluded to. In fact, it's 150 years ago this week that James K. Polk in his diary starts mentioning the frequency of cholera in Nashville. Sarah lived in that Nashville home, Polk Place, for all 42 years of her widowhood, and a proper Victorian widow, she wore black all 42 years.
Did she have anything to do behind the scenes with this president and what he did when he was in office?
Absolutely, and even during his state career, she came out from behind the scenes. When the Polks married on New Year's Day, 1824, almost immediately, his vocation became her avocation. She had a keen interest in politics. She shared her husband's democratic ideals. She would serve as her husband's political helpmate throughout his life. When he was running for the House of Representatives from Tennessee and also running as governor of Tennessee, Sarah was actually almost an informal campaign manager. While her husband was out campaigning in different towns, she stayed here and was his political eyes and ears at home.
And when they married, he was 28, she was 20. Our next call, we go to Norwich, Connecticut. You're on the air. Go ahead, please.
Good morning, Brian.
Hi.
I'm a great fan of President Polk. Mr. Holtzapfel has already commented on the controversial nature of the incursion by General Taylor into Mexico. I wonder if Dr. Seeley would comment on the spot resolution and Abraham Lincoln's connection with it, and how it contradicted Abraham Lincoln's entry into the Civil War. The spot resolution was quite popular and created a lot of political foment back at that time. Would he comment?
I'm afraid I have to tell you I'm not familiar with what you mean with the spot resolution.
spot resolution was Abraham Lincoln's demand that President Polk show the exact spot where the Mexican Zachary Taylor encounter took place that resulted in the deaths of some Mexican soldiers, which sparked the American enthusiasm to enter the war with Mexico.
You mean the reconnaissance? You mean the expedition that Taylor sent? That some? Are you talking about Taylor or Scott?
Well, I guess yeah, Scott. Who crossed the border?
The Rio Grande. It was when the reconnaissance men were killed, about 11 of them.
Yeah, and the spot resolution was highly controversial, and it created furor within the country to enter the war with Mexico, and Abraham Lincoln was against that war. And then, of course, later on, at the time of the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln found reason to enter the war with the South, and many people held that this was contrary to Lincoln's position in 1847 or 8, when that spot resolution created so much furor here in this country.
All right, thank you for the call, but let me just ask you this, to put into perspective. Abraham Lincoln was a one-term congressman. What was it, 1847?
47, he went
48. Did he have any clout then when he was in, and did people pay attention?
I don't think very much, no. But I'm not, I'm aware of the controversy, but I'm not aware, I can't address the spot resolution.
One more call, and we'll introduce you to Tom Price, who's been very patiently waiting. I think it's patiently. Wichita, Kansas. Go ahead, please.
Good morning.
Hi.
I have two questions for your guests and one for you, Brian. I'm a big fan of book notes, and I was wondering, has there ever been any thought of putting C-SPAN on the radio?
Oh, most definitely. We have a radio station in Washington, WCSP, which covers about an 8 million population area, and then we're going to go on a satellite radio at the end of the year 2000 where you'll be able to get it in your car.
Previous callers brought up the fact that slavery was prohibited by the Mexican Constitution. I think he said in 1824. Interesting. For your guest, one of the previous callers brought up the fact that slavery was prohibited by the Mexican Constitution. I think he said in 1824. My first question is, was that prohibition enforced by the Mexican government in Texas prior to the Texas Rebellion?
No. No, it was not.
They just winked at it?
Basically, one of the big problems was, of course, Mexico really wasn't administering Texas. I mean, yes, it had troops in different places, but it really wasn't administering Texas, and it was weak. It was, you could almost liken it to absentee ownership, maybe not that extreme, and that the neighbor wanted to develop the property, and they went in there and took advantage of the weakness. That's basically what happened, because the Anglo-Americans poured in from East Texas in various places and by sea, and were the predominant population by the time of the revolution and could make a revolution.
We found a copy of this book here in the Polk home, which was written by William Seal. For those of you who've watched this before, he's been on before and talked about this. For about $39, you can buy this double set called The President's House, and it's been in print since about 1987. And you've done other books on the White House that we have here. John Holtzapfel, give us, before we introduce everybody to Tom Price, give us a little bit about James Polk. What would his voice have sounded like?
We don't have too much information on that. The only thing I ever seen has been a comment by a congressman from Maine, John Fairfield, who's later a governor and senator, talking about James K. Polk and all these other congressmen from the West, meaning west of the Appalachians. He said that the Westerners spoke funny, and they'd use wrong words or have strange pronunciations, like say Clark instead of clerk, and cheer instead of chair. But other than that little letter note, I haven't heard anything about James K. Polk's speaking voice.
How tall was he, and how tall was his wife?
He was 5'7", which then was about average, maybe a bit below average height for a man, though with his physical frailness, he might have seemed smaller. Sarah was a very petite 5'2".
And Tom Price, who is from St. Lawrence County, New York. Welcome, and tell us where you are.
I'm in the aptly named museum room, a room where we highlight through artifacts James K. Polk's life and career.
What are you standing next to there?
Standing next to one of our more interesting artifacts, a bust of Andrew Jackson, given by Andrew Jackson to James K. Polk. And if you look closely at the base, you'll see a lock of hair, something a good friend would commonly give to a good friend of theirs in the 19th century.
I mean, they'd cut the hair off and say, here,
exactly right. During a haircut, you'd keep a portion of it and give it to friends.
When did we give up this tradition?
I'm not sure about that.
What else do you have in there?
A number of artifacts, as I said, from the different times of James K. Polk's life, campaign memorabilia. Probably the election of 1844 would not compete with the election of 1840, with the log cabin and hard cider campaign and the material culture that was being made for that particular election year. But a number of artifacts from the election of 1844, silk campaign ribbons. We've mentioned already in the program slogans like 5440 or fight, which were very prevalent on banners of the time period, and peace we love best, war if oppressed, again dealing with the northwestern border of the United States.
We'll come right back to you, Hurricane, West Virginia. Go ahead, please.
Hello. Goodness knows John Tyler has taken his knocks somewhat unjustly, I think, and perhaps this was mentioned on a prior program, but isn't it true that he signed the congressional resolution for the annexation of Texas and signed the bill for the admission of Florida as a state in the Union?
Yes, that's true. He did. Florida was a matter of course, but Texas, he did very quickly. When Polk was elected, Tyler did it, so it would be done within his administration.
Tom Price, this is your 30th year on this earth. How long have you been here?
I've been here 3 years next week.
What got you involved in all this?
Background, my education is in American history. Worked at the Silas Wright Museum in Canton, New York. John Holtzapfel mentioned earlier as a compromise candidate during the election of 1844. Polk would offer him the vice presidency. He would decline it. He would offer him the Secretary of the Treasury spot. He would decline it as well and wind up as governor of New York in 1844.
John Holtzapfel, why did you come here 15 years ago?
I've always had an interest in history. With my museum studies major, I was certainly looking for a job at a historic site. I love Jacksonian period history. I like Tennessee a lot, and this has been a perfect fit for me.
William Seal told us earlier that there were 20 million people in the United States back in 1844-45, and that there were 30 states. We go next to St. Louis, Missouri. Go ahead, please. Hello, St. Louis. You're on the air.
Hello. Pardon my ignorance on the subject in general, but I have a few questions. My first question is, I'm very interested in not architecture, I suppose, but in American history and how it's preserved through homes such as the Polk home here. And my first question would be, why is it, since Sarah Polk or Mrs. Polk outlived her husband by so many years, that the Polk home in Nashville was subsequently destroyed, and how did that come to be? Secondly, I was wondering if there are any Polk family members. I realized they did not have any children, but I was wondering if there are any Polk family members, cousins, anything like that, alive today. And thirdly, I was wondering if you might be able to give me any perspective of what the traditional role of the First Lady at that time in history would have been, and her role prior to her husband's death. And
let's start. Thank you. Yeah, thank you very much. Let's start with Tom Price. Any of those you want to answer, Tom Price?
Sure. The home in Nashville, called Polk Place, originally belonging to Polk's law mentor Felix Grundy. The Polks purchased it in 1848 while still living in the White House as a retirement home, a place of security in their old age. Polk, of course, would die there just 3 months after leaving the White House. Sarah would outlive him and live in that home for 42 remaining years until her death in 1891. There was a dispute in the family, in the Polk family, and Polk's will was a bit obscure on this point, but after Sarah's death, a dispute happened in the Polk family as to what should happen to the property. It was sold outside of the family, prime commercial real estate just off the Capitol grounds in Nashville. It was torn down a year later in 1901.
Let's go back. I want to go back to that photograph of that home, because there is that monument in the front yard that we'll see later where he was buried. How long was he buried there?
He was buried in the side yard It was 2 years after his death that I think he was brought there, so that would be 1851. And he was in that side yard until after Sarah's death in 1891 when both of their bodies were moved to the Capitol ground.
We'll tell our audience to look at that right now because you'll see that having moved in a few moments to the state Capitol grounds, which we have on some video. How about the First Lady part of all this? Actually, we're going to see it right now. That's the state Capitol in Tennessee, and as it pulls back, there is the monument where he is buried. And we won't do it now, but later we'll look at some of the actual script on there. John Holtzapfel, what about the First Lady? What was it like for her?
Sarah again played the political role as First Lady, though not as conspicuously as she had done when she was in Tennessee. Though it's interesting, folks in Washington, other Washington politicians, weren't sure how to deal with such a forthright, confident, politically savvy woman. George Mifflin Dallas, on first meeting Sarah Polk, assumed that she was domineering. He said that she's certainly mistress of herself, and he suspects of somebody else also. Interesting, though, all the correspondence of James K. Polk, his diary, seems to show a very different image of Sarah. He viewed her as a partner, as a confidant. Polk was a rather private man, some would even say secretive, and he knew he could trust Sarah. Dr. Seal, I think, could tell you a lot about Sarah as the elegant hostess in Washington.
In just a second, I want to make sure, I want Tom Price to show us in a couple of minutes the fan, which I found to be very interesting, which is in the, and then we'll go over to the daguerreotype. We also need to know about, there was a story about her adopting a child?
Toward the end of her life, yes.
Are there people running around today that have the name Polk somewhere that would come off of all that?
No, I don't think so. But correct me if I'm wrong, John.
Cousins, anything like that?
Oh, there are lots of cousins, and lots of the Polk family is very large family. I mean, they kept going from here. We brought him at the beginning from Maryland, the family down to Tennessee. They kept going to Arkansas, Texas, out west.
How many children were there in James Polk's family, brothers, sisters?
10.
10 altogether? Mm-hmm. And what about her entertaining?
Who, Sarah?
Sarah Childress in the White House.
Oh, she was a very elegant entertainer. She was a very beautiful woman, and however, she was a little bit of a shock to Washington society because, of course, all First Ladies have been, in a sense, partners with their husbands. To get that far, they've had to work together on things, but the First Ladies have always receded, and the man was on the stage. You've never had a fight for the stage. And Sarah Polk was that way, but maybe a little less so. There's one interesting letter which says, a woman says, "We never talked to Mrs. Polk much. She was always in the parlor with the men." And she was, would say, could be very abrupt. There was a reception once at the White House on a receiving line, and she said, this man said, this is an agreeable and beautiful entertainment, Mrs. Polk. And she says, is it not ever thus?
We're in Columbia, Tennessee. We're at the James Polk home where his parents lived, and he lived 6 years before he married Sarah Childress. We go to McLean, Virginia next. Go ahead, please.
Hi, Brian. This is Neil McDonald. We've met a couple of times in the Washington area. Outside of Borders Bookstore once. It's a wonderful series you're having, and I just would like to ask the curators if they would be interested in having one of my favorite possessions here. It's a lithograph, I believe, of the presidents of the United States. It's from the Polk period. It shows all 11 presidents, and James K. Polk being the latest one on there, and I was wondering if they might have room in the museum for yet another artifact from the period.
Neil, hold on just a second, because Tom Price, isn't there something like that right behind you over there?
Which direction?
I'm not sure. It's the one that shows the 11 presidents off to your right there on the wall.
It does. Shows all of the 11 presidents from Washington to James K. Polk. This is a fan called the National Fan, given to Sarah Polk by James K. Polk for the inaugural festivities, something she carried with her through the festivities of the inauguration.
Is Neil McDonald still on the line?
Here, Brian, I'm listening on the radio, and I can't see what you've got there. But this is about, I would say, 1 foot by 2 feet, and the presidents are shown in each one in a circular
Well, hold on just a second while you're on the phone, because let me ask our camera person upstairs to walk over there with Tom Price and look at that, and let's see if that isn't the same thing that our caller's talking about. It's over to the behind Tom Price. Can we move our camera back there, please, and see if that's it? It's got at the top it says Presidents of the United States. And then there's circular pictures of all the 11 at that time. Is that what you're talking about, Mr. McDonald?
Actually, this one has the Presidents of the United States at the bottom, and James K. Polk is at the bottom. George Washington is in the middle of the circle with the 10 presidents around him.
Okay, well, thank you for calling, and I'll ask Tom Price, are you interested in things like that?
We are actively collecting artifacts related to James K. Polk's life, including, my speculation is that was probably a lithograph made after Polk's presidencies. One of the many inventions being made during Polk's lifetime is lithography in the 1820s. It gives rise to popular printmaking in the United States, so many of those are made.
If you don't mind, I want you eventually, after I ask John Holtzapfel a call, to go back to that fan just one more time. And I want to ask John Holtzapfel about this place we're sitting in right now. How many people come here and visit?
We have visitation of about 13,000 visitors a year.
What's it cost to get in?
$5 admission fee for adults, $4 for senior citizens. We say that's 60 or over. $2 for students anywhere from age 6 up through college students, and no charge for younger children. They get a guided tour of the Polk home. They see the Sisters House Museum, an orientation video program, and then can see the gardens and grounds.
How long has this place been like it is today?
It opened to the public in 1929. It was actually a great-great-niece of President Polk who started the Historical Society. Very fortunate for us, because she had inherited many of the president's belongings, and she had the connections to other family members who had inherited presidential belongings, and she got the collection together. We're very fortunate to have so many original items that belong to President and Mrs. Polk.
And Tom Price, who runs this place? I mean, who owns it? Who oversees it?
It's the state of Tennessee actually owns the property, but the site is run by a private nonprofit organization called the Polk Memorial Association. That same organization that John mentioned was started by Polk's great-great-niece in the 1920s.
And we want to thank at this point three ladies, three very nice folks who actually served us dinner last night. I don't know why they were so hospitable, but we don't normally get that kind of treatment. But Carolyn Fisher, who's the past president of the James Polk Association, Dot Sowell, and Jane White. Is it Jane White is now the president? Or is it Dot Sowell?
Dot Sowell is the current president.
Yeah, it's S-O-W-E-L-L.
Right.
Now, Tom Price, tell us again about that fan. Where did it come from, and where did you get it?
Right. This is a gift from President Polk, President-elect James K. Polk, to Sarah Polk, given to her just before the inauguration ceremony in March of 1845. She carried it throughout the festivities of several days, but starting on that first inaugural day.
Is there only one of these?
There is only one of these. It's gilded paper with bone stiles throughout, showing every president from Washington and that large oval in the center all the way through President Polk on the right-hand side.
Who did this, do you know?
We're not sure who the maker of this particular piece was.
And how long have you had it?
We've had it. It came from Sarah Polk's estate through that great-niece and great-great-niece to this site in the 1920s.
Going to Burlingame, California, then we're going to look at the daguerreotype. Go ahead, Burlingame, you're on the air.
Yeah, I have two questions. One, General Grant in his memoirs stated that he thought that they were in Mexico because he was a member of Taylor's regiment, that they were there to start a war. And if your guest can talk about that. And second, how the United States happened to have a squadron of naval fleet off the coast of California. I'll take my answer off the air. Thanks.
William Seal.
But I didn't hear it all, but about California, Polk immediately started machinations in California to disrupt matters between Mexico and the people there through an secret agent named Thomas Larkin. And the ships were sent to California right after Polk took office, very soon, in Monterey Bay. They appeared there under Commodore Sloat, and it was all practically over then. California was in great discord at the time because there had been this huge influx people with enormous political power from Mexico who had come in to secularize all the church lands and get the missions were at that point abandoned. They were beautiful farms, you know, and taken in improved land by political favorites. And there was a certain American influx there already, nothing like Texas, of course. But this Larkin's letters back to Polk are very fascinating about what happened and the disruption that's created. If I got all the question, a fire engine went by. I don't know if you heard it everywhere.
We expect it here in Washington. We don't expect that, John Holtzapfel, here in Columbia, Tennessee. Tom Price, who was in the cabinet those 4 years?
Right. A number of men spread from throughout the country. Polk had a good mix of people from all the sections of the country, in the Northeast, the West, and the South. Actually, this is a good example that I can show you by a daguerreotype taken by John Plumb in the early part of Polk's administration, 1845, maybe 1846, showing the cabinet members. It is the first interior photograph of the White House ever taken.
Where was it taken?
It was taken in the state dining room of the White House.
And what is a daguerreotype?
A daguerreotype is the earliest form of photography, invented in France in 1839. It's actually a piece of copper that's plated with silver, given a high gloss, and then sensitized with chemicals. To give you an idea of a portrait of this type, portrait photography was still really pretty new during Polk's administration. It could take up to 2 minutes, depending on how much lighting you had in the area, to take your daguerreotype in terms of a portrait.
Who's in that photo, by the way?
It's Polk and his cabinet. From left, John Mason, a Virginian who is his attorney general. On his right, William Marcy, former governor of New York, would be Polk's Secretary of War. Seated to his right is James K. Polk. To his right, Robert J. Walker, a Mississippian, his Secretary of the Treasury. Standing in the back on the left is Cave Johnson from Tennessee, from Clarksville, Tennessee originally, was his Postmaster General. And on his right is George Bancroft, a noted American historian from the New England states.
Where's James Buchanan?
Buchanan's missing from this particular daguerreotype. This was taken on a Saturday morning. Polk often assembled his cabinet members to meet on Saturday mornings. Sarah Polk more or less tricked them into having this daguerreotype taken. John Mason, the man seated at the left, didn't really care to have his portrait painted or his daguerreotype taken. In the meeting, Sarah disrupted them and asked them to please come down into the state dining room. They did. John Plumb had already had his materials set up there, and she suffered them to have their daguerreotype taken. Mason, as you can see in the daguerreotype, has his head sort of cocked to the side. Now, I mentioned that it could take up to 2 minutes to have your daguerreotype taken. In order to immobilize the subject, they would put a clamp on the back of their head to hold them perfectly still. John Mason refused to have the clamp done. His head is sort of tilted to the side, refusing to do so, but the daguerreotype came out nicely.
William Seal, 4 terms away, James Buchanan is President of the United States, the 15th President. How old was he? You have any idea when he was Secretary of State?
Frankly, I don't remember. He was an old-time political official, though. That picture is one of the great pictures, anyway, the oldest picture ever taken in the first picture that we ever know of, and the Polks were interested in photography. They are photographed, believe it or not. And I think the picture's interesting because all the cabinet is in black, except for Bancroft, who's in white. See him, and he will leave the cabinet because he opposes the war.
That's George Bancroft of Columbia University, the Bancroft Award, and all that?
Mm-hmm.
What was he, Secretary of Navy?
Secretary of the Navy, and he resigned with Polk's blessing because he could not condone the war.
Blairsville, Georgia, you're next. Go ahead, please.
Yes, my question concerns Polk's earlier political career. Could you expand on his connection with President Jackson, other supporters of expansionism, such as Francis P. Blair of Kentucky, and more minor expansionist political parties, such as the Union Party?
Is Blairsville, Georgia, named after Francis P. Blair?
Possibly.
Okay,
We're not
thanks.
sure at the moment.
John Holtzapfel?
Throughout his political career, James K. Polk was a disciple of Jacksonian democracy. He followed Jackson on almost all of Jackson's issues, nullification, strong unionism. often think of states' rights and unionism as being opposed to each other, but in the case of Jackson and certainly Polk, that wasn't the case. James K. Polk believed in a very strong union, that the government, the United States, had to stay together, and he thought the best way of doing that was giving some leeway to the states. He also thought expansionism was crucial for unionism. Some of the divisions of North and South can be overlooked if everyone's looking to the West.
We're going to look at the first stamp here in a few moments. Paradise Hills, New Mexico. You're next.
Hi, this is Tom Hughes calling from an organization called the Food Museum. And we wondered if your guest could tell us something about a story that we've had about the Oregon Territory, in which the British and the Americans almost came to blows over, I think it was an American pig getting into a British settler's potato patch. This was in the San Juan Islands. And also, are there any places named Polk around the U.S. or named after President Polk?
Counties, Polk County. The pig incident I remember, but I can't tell you any more about it than that.
John Holtzapfel?
The pig incident came, I think, in 1859. It was definitely during the Buchanan administration. When Polk settled the Oregon dispute, or Oregon boundary, the compromise was the 49th parallel. As a concession to Great Britain, all of Vancouver Island went to Canada, to Great Britain, even though the southernmost end extended a bit south. San Juan Island was still sort of a question mark, had been sort of overlooked, confusion over wording about the line going right through a channel, and I think there's a channel north of the island and south of the island. But in the 1850s, I believe it was an American living on the island, killed a pig that belonged to the British Hudson Bay Company, and it almost led to fighting. Winfield Scott, so prominent in the Mexican War, would be sent by James Buchanan out to San Juan Island, but there was never any fighting there. In fact, I think there's a National Park Service site there that's sort of a memorial to peace, of settling disputes peacefully rather than with arms.
Levi Woodbury and Robert Greer were his two Supreme Court appointments. Anybody know who they were or why they got there?
Levi Woodbury was a New Englander, a strong supporter of James K. Polk. Polk, in selecting his cabinet and also in selecting his Supreme Court justices, was very careful to select people from different parts of the country. He wanted a New Englander to start with, and Woodbury fit the bill. Greer was a Pennsylvanian, and I think kind of interesting, before Greer was asked, Polk considered asking James Buchanan, and there was sort of almost a little dance back and forth that Polk would ask Buchanan, and then Buchanan wasn't sure if he wanted it, and then Buchanan was wanting it, and Polk wasn't sure if he'd offer it, and Polk wasn't a patient man in situations like that, and he finally selected a Robert Greer, I think from the Pittsburgh area.
Tom Price, show us the stamp, please.
Stamps were first issued July 1st, 1847. A great deal of postal reform during Polk's presidency, and for all intents and purposes, the modern postal system was started. Before stamps were issued, it wasn't the sender who was paying for postage. More often, it was the receiver. And because of that, a lot of mail was never delivered. If you didn't want the letter that the person sent you, you refused to pay for it, there would be a large bureaucracy called the Dead Letter Bureau, where these letters which were not accepted would wind up. But during Polk's administration, Cave Johnson, his Postmaster General, with the help of Congress, obviously, passed an act that started the use of stamps. 2 stamps in the first issue, a 5-cent Benjamin Franklin and a 10-cent George Washington, the father of the country and the father of the postal system.
Tom Price, what's your favorite thing in the museum?
Favorite thing probably would be the daguerreotype. I'm interested in early photography, 19th century photography. They're one of a kind. It was nearly impossible to make a copy of a daguerreotype, so they're very special artifacts.
Tom Price is curator of collections. We thank you very much for this tour of the museum here at the James K. Polk home. By the way, what's K stand for, Tom Price?
That would be Knox.
And which Knox is it?
John Knox, the Presbyterian reformer. Polk's mother's maiden name was Knox, and she was a direct descendant of John Knox.
William Steele and John Holtzapfel will continue with us as we continue our calls and our discussion. The 202-626-4858 number I want you to have. That's our C-SPAN in the classroom number, 202-626-4858 for teachers. You can get the teacher's kit shipped to your home. cspan.org/classroom is the
Our American President series continues with a look at the nation's 11th president, James K. Polk. Earlier this year in our series, we visited the home of President Polk, located in Columbia, Tennessee, where we talked with historians William Seal and John Holtzapfel about Polk's career and his impact on the United States. The program's 2.5 hours and begins with a brief video biography. James Knox Polk was considered by many to have been a dark horse when he was nominated for president in 1844, despite his political resume. Polk had served as governor of Tennessee from 1839 to 1841. Before that, he had been a member of the U.S. House of Representatives for 14 years. He's still the only president to have served as Speaker of the House. Nevertheless, a newspaper reported many were astonished by the news of his nomination, and some even wondered if the newly invented telegraph wasn't broken. The opposition Whig Party campaign slogan became, "Who is Polk?" He was born November 2nd, 1795, in Mecklenburg County, North Carolina, but moved with his family to Tennessee by the age of 10. He graduated with honors from the University of North Carolina in 1818 and went on to study law. He was nicknamed Young Hickory because of his staunch support of Andrew Jackson, Polk the Plotter for the conscientiousness he showed while Speaker, and Napoleon of the Stump because of his short stature. His hair was straight and combed back off his face, and he had deep-set, penetrating gray eyes. He was said to have lacked charisma and a sense of humor. He was also uncomfortable in social situations. At White House functions, guests were rushed past the president, and an aide would repeat continuously, "Guests who have been presented will please walk into the East Room. Don't block up the passage." His moderate consumption of alcohol prompted an enemy to once say his problem was that he drank too much water. He married the intelligent and refined Sarah Childress when he was 28 and she was 20. She was said to have enjoyed her social duties when Polk was a congressman, and even more so when he was elected president. A devout Presbyterian, she banned dancing and hard liquor at official White House functions. She was the first to host the now annual Thanksgiving dinner at the White House. She offered her husband advice on public policy and often highlighted newspaper articles for him to read. His inauguration took place on a rainy March 4th, 1845. His vice president was George Mifflin Dallas, after whom Dallas, Texas was named. The catchphrase most closely associated with Polk is "Manifest Destiny," the push to expand the country westward. Following the Mexican War in 1848, the United States gained over 500,000 square miles of new territory. Polk was in a continual state of poor health. At age 17, he successfully had surgery without the aid of antiseptics or anesthesia. He was plagued with stomach problems for the majority of his life. When his term ended, Polk retired. He wrote in his diary, "I feel exceedingly relieved that I am now free from all public cares. I am sure I'll be a happier man in my retirement than I have been during the 4 years I have filled the highest office in the gift of my countrymen." Following Zachary Taylor's inauguration, Polk embarked on a 1-month tour of the South. He fell ill during this time and died on June 15, 1849, 3 months after returning to Polk Place in Tennessee. He was 53.
Welcome to the 11th of our 41 programs on American presidents. You're looking at the home of President James K. Polk's parents in Columbia, Tennessee, about 50 minutes south of the Nashville, Tennessee airport, a town of 35,000 people, just 6 miles from the Spring Hill Saturn automobile plant. As a young man, James Polk lived in this home for about 6 months prior to his marriage, and it was the only home connected with President Polk still in existence. Our guests for the next 2.5 hours will include William Seal, author and historian, John Holtzapfel, director of the James K. Polk Home, and Thomas Price, curator of collections, also at the James K. Polk Home. Got some telephone numbers to give you. Once you get you involved right away. We've got historians from all over the United States who have joined us in this series and add a lot to the program, and you can begin dialing now. There are lines open to call on 202-624-1111 if you live in the Eastern and Central time zone, 202-624-1115 if you live in the Mountain and Pacific time zone. Dr. Seal, where are we?
Well, we're in Columbia, Tennessee, in the home of James K. Polk's parents. And the house is a museum today, used as a place to assemble the Polk's memorabilia. I think it was just as he had with Speaker of the House, he decided it was time for him to go, and he left.
He was also one of 26 lawyers who served as President of the United States. 15 presidents were Mason. He was also a member of that organization. He was one of 16 presidents who served as governor. He was governor for 2 years in the state of Tennessee. However, he went on to lose 2 races in the future, as John Holtzapfel told us earlier. And depending on which history book you're reading, he and Andrew Johnson were the only 2 presidents born in North Carolina. And you can get a dispute on that because Andrew Jackson is claimed by both South Carolina and North Carolina. We go next to Mesa, Arizona. Go ahead, please.
I'd like to know, was President Polk a very good friend with Franklin Pierce, who would succeed him in 1852? And is it true that the Democratic Party put out a slogan, "We poked you in 44, we shall pierce you in 52"?
Yes.
Is that true?
That's true. Yes,
John Holtzapfel, did you know anything about that?
Yes, that is quite true. There were a lot of puns on Polk's name. Like the Democrats were trying to poke Andrew Jackson's policies down America's throat, or that in a race against the Whig Henry Clay, the Democratic candidate was too pokey to win. The one that might be maybe the best, or really say the most, since James K. Polk was viewed as an unknown candidate, as a dark horse, the Whigs called him a pig in a poke, an unknown commodity.
And on your website, you have that little Q&A that's fun to do. The 7th question, and anybody that wants to do this can get on www.jameskpolk, all in lowercase letters, .com. And if you get on there, you have this question: which of the following was not a political slogan during the election of 1844? The question again is, which of the following was not a political slogan? Who is James K. Polk was one of them. 54, 40, or fight was another one. James K. Polk and George M. Dallas, one for the rope, the other for the gallows. That turns out, I guess, to be true. The one that isn't on this was not a slogan, is free soil, free labor, free speech. But where did that slogan come from? One for the rope, the other for the gallows, John Holtzapfel?
A clever Whig had come up with that. There are all sorts of sloganeering at that time, a good way of getting popular involvement in this Democratic era. One that I like best to describe the Whig positions. The Whigs are protectionists, but never protectionists. It pretty much follows Henry Clay's philosophy of strong tariffs and strong federal programs for internal improvements, but don't bring Texas into the country, at least not now.
James K. Polk's vice president was George Dallas. The city of Dallas, Texas is named after him. We go to Harvey, Louisiana next. Go ahead, please. You're on the air.
Yes, hello. I have in front of me my pension record of my 4th great-grandfather, Henry Goodnight, where he applied for his pension in the Revolutionary War. And he, in 1832, Will C. Forney appeals to James K. Polk for Henry Goodnight. And at the bottom here it says that inscribed on the roll of West Tennessee at the rate of $8 per month to commence on the 6th day of May 1832. Certificate of pension issued the 10th of May 1832 and sent to the Honorable J.K. Polk. Now, he was congressman at that time?
32?
Yes.
Yes, he was in the Congress.
Yes, I have that, a copy of that here, and I thought that very interesting.
He was head of Ways and Means. He had just been appointed to that. and he was very powerful in the Congress. And the next year he came up with a statement, a very important legal statement, position paper sort of, supporting Andrew Jackson's battle to destroy the Second Bank of the United States. And that's when he gained the nickname Young Hickory.
John Holzapfel, what were his talents to become Speaker of the House? And why do you think only one person has ever become president from being the Speaker?
I think Dr. Seal said it very well when he said that James K. Polk was good at maneuvering. He was good at the behind-the-scenes politicking. I've heard some historians speculate that that's why so few speakers of the House become president, that the skills, the sort of behind-the-scenes skills to bring about legislation are often, the people who have those skills are different from the individuals who could command a strong popular following. For James K. Polk, those maneuvering skills really helped him with some of his economic goals, lowering the tariffs, one of his pledge, and that really took some congressional arm twisting. In fact, I believe somewhere in his diary he writes that he considers tariff reductions his most difficult accomplishment.
John Holzapfel is originally from York, Pennsylvania. He has a bachelor's from the University of Delaware. He has a master's from Cooperstown Graduate Program in History and Museum Studies. Been here for 15 years. And what's that behind you?
A very unusual portrait. At least that's the reaction of most visitors to the Polk home, who don't expect to see a picture of the 16th century Spanish conqueror of Mexico, Cortez. For people in the 1840s, though, that picture would be very familiar. Dr. Seal had mentioned the William H. Prescott book, The Conquest of Mexico. It was a best-selling history book, and that image of Cortez was right on the frontispiece of the book. It's almost emblematic of the controversy and the extreme sides and views on the Mexican War. For some looking at that picture of Cortez, it suggests heroism and romanticism. For others, it suggests conquest. And the harshest critics of Polk on the Mexican War have compared him to a conqueror. In the case of this particular portrait, its meaning was nothing like that. It was a gift to Sarah Polk from a Mexican War general, a William Worth, for whom Fort Worth is named.
We are going to be at Zachary Taylor National Cemetery on Monday for the 12th President of the United States, Zachary Taylor. Get a chance to continue this, another general in the White House.
That painting of Cortez, very interestingly, at the end of his administration, President Polk ordered a statue of Jefferson put in front of the White House to identify himself with Jefferson, the expansionist, and Jeffersonian ideals. Sarah Polk hung that portrait of Cortez in the Blue Room. It hung in the Blue Room of the White House for about a year to give her view of his achievement as a conquistador.
San Diego, go ahead, please.
Yes, good morning, gentlemen. Listen, I think as we talk about his legacy, I think that we're leaving out a very important aspect of his legacy. Another one of James Polk's legacy was indeed slavery. He did nothing to prevent it. As a matter of fact, President Polk did a lot to keep blacks in servitude, and it was under his secretaryship under Buchanan. It was actually James Polk that was behind the Dred Scott. He helped draft the legislative information that pretty much prohibited, the abolition of slavery, and it stated that the Dred Scott did not have a right to be free. And so I think that when you look at the fact that it was him and James Buchanan who was instrumental in in the Dred Scott decision, I think that Mr. Polk is, I don't know, he's not anything to be proud of for me as a black, and I'm really disappointed that we're not talking about that.
Well, I think you'll find that Dred Scott was after Polk's death. Yes, it did involve Buchanan, but after Polk's death, yes, Polk was a slaveholder. He did nothing to curb or stop slavery at all. That maybe in the 1850s he possibly would have. But even remember, Lincoln himself originally was only for curbing slavery, not for stopping it, not opposing it. That came later.
Caller, let me ask you why you have paid so close attention to this particular subject.
Well, the reason why, because I'm black and I'm also a historian myself, and I feel that we continue to do the country a disservice when we discuss a lot of our forefathers, but we leave out, their part of slavery, which was indeed a humanity against, man. It was really crimes against humanity. And we can't continue to just nonchalantly discuss our forefathers while leaving out, an important crime that these men committed. And I just think it continues to say business as usual, that what happened with these presidents on slavery wasn't a big deal. And I just think it's sad when we can talk about Mr. Polk and not discuss the slavery legacy.
Okay. I would agree and disagree with you. You're a historian too, and you know history's rewritten all the time. That's one of the values of it. And it is being rewritten a lot now, as it certainly should be. But we always have to bear in mind the context of the period. And of course, there's things that we cannot tolerate today or admire, but we need to understand them, and you're quite right about the rewriting of these things.
West Des Moines, Iowa, you're next. Go ahead, please. You're on the air.
Hi, Brian. I sure enjoy your show.
Thanks.
I live in Polk County, Iowa, and which was named after President Polk, and I think there's a Polk County in Florida. And I would like to add that Iowa was admitted in 1846, and it's a non-slave state, and we're proud of that fact, and I'd just like to add that. Thank you.
One of the things that we're going to see this later on is a church, John Holtzapfel, over here, where it says he was the 10th president of the United States. How much did religion play in his life at all?
A Polk scholar at the University of Tennessee, Dr. Wayne Cutler, once told me he thought that Polk's greatest religious zeal was toward Jacksonian democracy. Nevertheless, James K. Polk was a spiritual man, or a man with spiritual searching. He came from a very divided family. His grandfather, Ezekiel, was an outspoken religious skeptic, was a deist who did believe in a creator God, but not a personal God. On the other hand, James K. Polk's mother, as Tom Price mentioned earlier, was a descendant of John Knox, the Presbyterian reformer. When James was just an infant, his mother insisted that he be baptized in the local Presbyterian church in Mecklenburg County, North Carolina. The parents took James to the minister, who demanded that the parents make a statement of faith. That was no problem for the mother, but James K. Polk's father refused to make that statement. As a result, James K. Polk wasn't baptized as an infant. He was raised as a Presbyterian. He regularly attended Presbyterian services with his wife, but wasn't baptized till his deathbed, and then by a Methodist minister, a man he had heard preach as early as 1833, a Methodist revival preacher named John McFerrin. The window at the First Methodist Church here in First United Methodist Church in Columbia commemorates James K. Polk as a Methodist. The window also mentions, as you did, Brian, that he's the 10th president of the United States. There was some confusion over the counting of John Tynger, whether Tynger as a non-elected president should be counted. In fact, once in his diary, James K. Polk even wrote, "I am the 10th elected president and the 11th man to serve in this office." The window at the church says James K. Polk, 10th president of the United States. James K. Polk and the religious issue certainly ties into with your caller from San Diego, who brought up the important issue of slavery. Some of the biggest criticism that James K. Polk received during his administration on the slave issue was from the Christian community, especially in New England. In 1847, when James K. Polk took a tour of New England, he stopped at Boston and was presented a letter by an abolitionist society that included Garrison and Phillips. It was a respectful but very pointed letter saying that James K. Polk, as a a self-described Democrat and a self-described Christian shouldn't be owning slaves. For the Democrat, they bring up, do you really believe that all men are created equal? If so, how can you hold slaves? And perhaps the most pointed remark in the letter was the challenge of how can anyone enslave, or I think the term was, how can anyone view as merchandise those for whom Christ suffered and died? We don't know how James K. Polk responded particularly to that letter. We know as a unionist, he was a compromiser. He had to do all he could to try to hold the Union together, and for that reason, he did what the caller said he did. He tried to hide the slavery issue. In his will, he did stipulate that his slaves be emancipated after Mrs. Polk's death, but certainly in the eyes of the abolitionists, that was too little, too late.
And John Holzapfel, thank you very much. We will we'll hopefully join you before this program is over, and we're going to be talking with a student from Cedar Rapids, Iowa, by the name of Lindsay Williams in just a moment. First, Elgin, Illinois. You're our next caller. Go ahead, please.
Hi, Brian.
Hi.
How you doing?
Good. Welcome.
I know that you like books, and I know you like statistics, and I know you like modern references to American history, so I'll have one of each for you here.
Go.
First is a book not particularly about Polk, but it is about the Mexican-American War in part, and it's called The Class of 1846 by John Waugh, W-A-U-G-H, and it's about the West Point class of 1846, which included T.J. Jackson and George McClellan, and it's about their experiences, and a lot of the other younger officers, their experiences in the Mexican-American War, and how that led to their, their way they thought during the American Civil War. Of course,
now it's books about 2 or 3 years old.
Yeah, I heard on C-SPAN a few weeks ago that it's out of print now, so you might have to do a little digging around for it, but it's worth it if you can find it.
Okay, what else do you want to point out?
Also, a statistic, actually a question, you guys might want to look into this. I know that you have statistics on just about everything you can think of for the presidents. I see that James K. Polk was the oldest of 10 children. I think it'd be interesting to find out how many presidents were the oldest, the youngest, the middle, or something like that, and see if you can draw any conclusions from that. And the last thing people might be interested in is there's a rock band called They Might Be Giants, and they have an album called Factory Showroom, and on that album they have a song called James K. Polk. And the song is it's not funny or anything, but it's pretty much just a real good review of the election of 1844 in quite a bit of detail.
How'd you find this?
How'd I find the album?
Yeah.
I bought it from something else that I had heard on the radio, put it in the stereo, and next thing I know, I'm getting educated about the election of 1844.
Thanks very much for the call. That's why we have calls. And I wanted to point out to the lady from San Diego, that's why we have calls also, as that there hasn't been any of these programs of the 11 where the slavery issue hasn't been discussed. Often it's brought up by callers, often by African Americans, and that's why we do it the way we do it, so that we can get as many different parts of this discussion here on the air and talked about. We have Lindsay Williams somewhere in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. Good morning. How are you?
Good.
What year in school are you?
What?
What year in school are you? What grade are you in your school?
5th grade.
And do you know why that they name your school after Mr. Polk?
Well, he was important to our country, and a lot of other schools are named after famous people too. And so I guess somebody just picked Polk.
What have you learned about James Polk because your school is named after him?
I learned a lot of stuff about him. I learned about his childhood and importance to Iowa, and about the Mexican War and stuff like that.
What do you know about his the problems he had with his health when he was young?
Well, he lacked physical stamina,
and at the age of 17, and he had gallstones too, and he had to go to the operating table, and all he had to help him with his pain was a little jar of whiskey, and he had to get his stomach cut open to get the gallstones out.
Do you talk about that at school where you go?
Yeah.
How many kids are there in your middle school there? Or is it, I guess it's a grade school.
Yeah, 350.
And where is Cedar Rapids, Iowa located?
Well, it's in Iowa, and it's located about,
Is it near, have you ever been over to the, I was just in your town a few weeks ago. Have you ever been over to the Herbert Hoover Library right there?
No.
Why don't you ask your teachers to take you to President Hoover's library sometime in the fall?
Okay.
Okay?
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Lindsay Williams, for joining us.
Thank you.
Have you ever taught school?
Yes.
What year?
It was in college. I taught college years ago for about 3 years.
From what you know, how do you assess the way history is being taught now?
I've only seen some textbooks, and they've gotten awfully political. And I think the whole history has to be taught in a participating way. You got to have the facts, but I think you have to know how history is made, what it's made from documents, and young people can do that. Freshmen in college can certainly do it.
What year did you do this book?
92.
And what's in it?
It's about the architecture of the White House. It's not a social history. It's about the architecture and when it was built, who designed it, and the various changes through the years.
What's this one sell for?
$40, $45. I don't remember.
Is it? And who puts it out?
American Institute of Architects.
Does the White House Historical? I know you're involved with the White House Historical Society. Do they have your books available?
Yes. In Washington.
How do people get a hold of them?
Well, they can call the number. I actually brought it this time, 1-800-555-2451. And the White House Historical Association has lots of products, including a journal, which comes out twice a year, about the history of the White House.
So that number again is 1-800-555-2551.
No, 2451.
Oh, goodness.
555-2451.
And is somebody answer it, or is it just a tape that you...
No, it'll be answered.
Boston, Massachusetts, for William Seal. Go ahead, please.
Hi, Brian. It's a delight to see you back on the air on this program, and thank you for plugging Bill Seal's books because they're all wonderful. I just have an observation to make in response to the inevitable caller on the subject of slavery. Of all of our presidents who were slaveholders, there were only two who asked in their wills that their slaves be freed upon their deaths. One was George Washington. The other was James K. Polk. Now, if you understand the context, obviously, of the 19th century slave economy, Mrs. Polk had no pension. She had no Social Security, and therefore it's understandable why she never freed those slaves. But I think it's an observation that needed to be made, and thank you for allowing me the opportunity to do that.
That is a good observation.
Why do you think it's important?
Why is it important to observe that? Well,
yeah.
Because, I think there's a great deal more going on in this man's psyche than that he was simply a slaveholder who didn't think about the issue and the broader picture.
I would agree, because to buy a plantation in Mississippi as an investment to support him and his wife for the rest of their lives would be like buying stocks or an annuity or something like that today. I mean, this was big money, those cotton plantations down there. And slavery, unfortunately, was just a part of it. It was a part of the story. Obviously, it concerned him that they had no children to leave their estate to, that he wanted these people freed when she died, but she needed to be cared for. As it turned out, she sold it all in 1858.
What did they do with slaves when they went to the White House? Did any of them go to the White House with them?
Oh, yes, with the Polks, with everyone who was slaveholder. They were house servants, or usually, to my knowledge. It's hard to find out about them. The most I know about them is they had ferocious battles with the white staff, the permanent staff, which was usually French or Belgian, and didn't speak English terribly well. And
the French or Belgian?
Yes, and the slaves, of course, were from the family, and they usually lived in the family quarters. They didn't live in the servants' quarters, and they took orders from the family. They interacted with the family, as they always had, and they never provided a harmonious element in the staff. They said they were with the family. Now, Thomas Jefferson said he wished he didn't have to use people from the farm because you could fire employee servants, but you couldn't fire slaves, and they were there. No, they very much figure, and I wish a few had written a memoir, and I keep hoping some of these are going to turn up.
About a half hour left in Columbia, Tennessee, about 50 minutes south of Nashville, Tennessee, the capital of the state. And you can come visit on I-65. It's easy to find. You can see there on the screen the relationship between Nashville and Memphis, kind of in the Nashville being in the middle of the state, I-65 running all the way up to Chicago and down through the south. We go to Eugene, Oregon next. Go ahead, please.
Good morning, Brian. My name is Joan, and I am in Eugene now, but I grew up in Houston, Texas, and I left there in 1969. And so I have a sense of living around black people. They were my neighbors when I grew up, just lived around the corner from me. And I guess my sense, when we look at our history, is that the slaves were first, the black people were slaves of their own people originally, and I'm not sure, but I think slavery probably still exists some places around the world. And just starting a new nation, not having, the Industrial Revolution had not occurred. The only way to get, things planted and crops, reaped or whatever, you needed people. And I suspect, and I'm waiting for people to recognize that though slavery is wrong and perhaps was wrong, that it was a means of actually integrating this country with people from Africa. Had not they had a service for us, had not we met them and come to, love them as people, as human beings, they wouldn't be making the advances they are now. And I think the greatest thing for black people would be to go back and bring Africa, into the 20th century. I just wish people would look at the gift of this. Yes, it was not right at the time, but it provided a means to introduce the African race to the Europeans.
Eugene, Oregon, thank you. And I'll ask John Holzapfel, how do you think other African Americans listening to this will greet what she just said?
I'll let them speak for themselves on that issue. Certainly, the whole issue of slavery was extremely controversial in Polk's administration. Was something not mentioned yet on the slavery issue, but it became crucial in Polk's administration and later administrations, was something called the Wilmot Proviso. When James K. Polk during the Mexican War, Polk went to Congress for an appropriation. By now it became clear that the Polk administration had goals, since the war had already started, to acquire territory as indemnity from the war. Wilmot was a freshman congressman, Democratic congressman from Pennsylvania, who had supported Polk on most issues, but was taking a lot of heat in industrial Pennsylvania for supporting Polk's tariff reduction. And he stood up in Congress and proposed that any new territory that came into the country as a result of the war with Mexico prohibit slavery. Now, James K. Polk himself thought it was a moot point. He didn't think there would be slavery in any of the territory, but people with strong ideals on both sides, opponents of slavery spoke up, supporters of slavery like John C. Calhoun spoke up, and it frustrated Polk to no end that there was a hot debate over an issue, again, a point that he thought was moot. Incidentally, Wilmot's proposal wasn't based on the moral objections that we talked about to slavery, but on a concern for free labor. There was concern about unemployment in the Northeast. We haven't mentioned the potato famine in Ireland, and even before that, all the new Irish immigration into the United States, especially the Northeast. And there was concern that all these immigrants were taking away jobs from people who lived in America for a long while. There was also concern that Polk's tariff legislation would make people lose jobs. So Wilmot started promoting the idea of westward expansion for free labor, that the West offered opportunity for people who didn't have a job in New York or Boston or Philadelphia to go west and get a job, but that wouldn't be the case if they allowed slavery there. So the Wilmot Proviso would keep coming up again and again and again through many administrations. The Whigs and slavery opponents would attach it to almost any bill as just a way of calling the slavery issue to the forefront.
Shawnee, Oklahoma, you're next. Shawnee, Oklahoma, you're next.
Yes, Brian, how are y'all doing?
Fine, sir. Please go right ahead with your comment or question.
What the lady was talking about slavery a while ago, and she is objecting to it. I noticed that in my family tree we have slaves that was in our bunch, but there's nothing wrong with what the way the economy was run back then. We just have a society today that opposes that, and I wonder if we put everything into the political aspect of today, would it actually transpire to back in those days, would we have the same result? I want to hang up and see what y'all...
I'm not really sure I understand what you're saying. Are you saying that it was okay to have slavery back then because of the times?
Yes, I mean, it was not against the law, and right now there's a lot of things that's not against the law, but it's politically correct to do it, but it may not be in everybody's point of view. And so what my question is, if it was all right and there was nobody being hurt, less than 1 to 5% of the population was in slavery, and the other people didn't even own slaves, but that was their way of livelihood, and what we have to do is go back in time and adjust ourselves to that kind of stuff. And people today do not like to go back and admit to that. And I was wondering what the doctor has to say on that. And I'll just hang up and let y'all talk about that.
Well, I would say, in answer to that, that slavery was never really welcomed into this American system. It swept in from the 18th century, and the Americans had to cope with it. You'll remember Jefferson said, slavery is, if I can remember the quote just right, is everything in the system, slavery is like a fire bell in the night, waking us for the trouble it's going to cause. It was utterly incompatible. For all its inhumanity, it was utterly incompatible with the system, the American system as outlined in the Constitution of independence, freedom, individual freedom, and all this. This was a bad seed in the system, and it had to be coped with eventually. Some say, speculatively, that the machine age that came in would have ended it naturally, 10 years, 15 years after the Civil War. But nevertheless, it was a burr under the saddle of the entire American nation from the very beginning, and it swept in. It wasn't created in this nation. It came from colonial days. It was a given. And I don't think it was ever considered a good thing or a normal thing. I mean, even the explanations of the time of the 1840s and 50s don't really make much sense.
We have some videos showing what this town looks like, Columbia, Tennessee, about 35,000 people, and we're not but about 6 or 7 miles away from Spring Hill, Tennessee, where you're laughing at the meal there.
That's the most wonderful festival. I've been several times. It's fantastic.
As I was saying,
the meals come from all over the United States, and they're dressed in their finest regalia, and they're beautifully behaved and very proud to be here.
The one thing I want to ask you, I was visiting in the town yesterday and went into some of the shops where they have paintings and lithographs and things like that, and a lot of the paintings all showed Confederate flags in them. Do you think folks down here are still fighting that war?
No, I don't think they're fighting that war at all. I think it's sort of a fad. I think it's in the South. People sort of enjoy it. It says South. I don't think that when people put up a Confederate flag, they think of, we're going to fight again and raise Robert E. Lee from the dead. Maybe some few people do. I think it's just sort of a sticker people have on the South.
William Seal, originally from Beaumont, Texas. We go to Charleston, West Virginia. Go ahead, please. Charleston, you're on the air, please.
Hi, good morning.
Hi.
It's really interesting that President Polk is like such an enigma to most Americans, and I think the variety of them have no idea who he actually is. And I was kind of curious as if you could discuss, like, say, the Mexican-American War and maybe why President Polk decided to sign a treaty rather than continue his expansionist policies towards Mexico.
Well, that was the question at the time. That was a big question at the time. Keep going, take Mexico, annex Mexico into the Union. I don't think that was ever a majority view, but a lot of people thought that this was a good idea, but also a lot of people said, no, this is an existing population. In fact, it's an ancient population, and it would never work. We've not had to face that before. I mean, the American Indians or Native Americans were relatively small in number compared to Mexico. And but I do think you need to see the war in terms of this man's life, as we've discussed on this show, that he came from a family that lived in terms of land, in an era that lived in terms of land, and land was money, and expansion. The American system was fed and nourished on land, that people that didn't have anything could go and get cheap land and make them a farm and sell an improved farm to somebody for far more than they had in it, and then go to new land and get cheap land again, but more of it that time. It was a pattern constantly repeated, not necessarily with big plantations, but on even a small level. All across the United States, this is what they saw. Mexico was land. California was land. Nobody thought much that the land in between California and middle central Texas would ever be used for much, because it was considered kind of a desert, as it was down into Mexico. But they wanted the land, and it even went on into the 1850s with the Gadsden Purchase. That little white slither on the map at the bottom end, right by Mexico, the green desert of Arizona, was Phoenix, and all was purchased in 1853. There you are on the map at the bottom there, under Mexican cession. For the Transcontinental Railroad, then, Southerners wanted it to go through there and through the South instead of where it went above. And I think you cannot overemphasize the issue of land with rich man and poor man alike. The minority were people who worked on wages and salaries and had cash money.
Dr. Seal got a PhD from Duke University, and what was your thesis in?
On Sam Houston.
Las Cruces, New Mexico, you're next.
Yes, sir. I was curious how James K. Polk became president. Henry Clay never did. He was the giant of his time.
That was his problem.
Yeah.
I think that was Clay's problem. He was too emphatic, and he was the man who should have been but never was.
John Holsample, any comment on that?
James K. Polk was really riding the crest of the wave of expansionism, which Dr. Seal had alluded to. Henry Clay made a position decision that might have been quite realistic and intelligent, but wasn't very politically shrewd. It turned out that Clay was going to take Martin Van Buren's position on the annexation of Texas, that by annexing Texas, it'll bring the slavery issue to the forefront. That would divide the political parties, that would divide the nation. This was a time when the nation's economy was just getting strong. We didn't need such a divisive issue at that time. Clay was also concerned it might lead to war with Mexico. He was right on both issues, but wrong with the public mood.
We want to thank Columbia Cablevision, the Rifkin cable television company, Chris Karn, who is the manager of that system, for helping us out here in Columbia. The bus and the crew moves up to Louisville, Kentucky for a Monday program devoted to the 12th President of the United States, Zachary Taylor, at the National Cemetery there in Louisville, and will be on the air from 9 o'clock on Monday morning for 2 hours, 2.5 hours. As we go next on the telephone to Waynesboro, Georgia. Go ahead, please. You're on the air.
Good morning, gentlemen.
Morning.
Yes, I was calling because I'm going to come out of my comfort zone this morning and identify myself as a black American. I was just infuriated by the woman, I think she was from Boston, and where I can appreciate that I really do believe she thinks she's saying the right thing. But to say to black people that the best thing for them was the institution of slavery, that's a bitter pill. As a Southerner, when I look back at my own family history, I think what white people don't understand is how painful this is even the simple act of genealogy. When you look back and you get to 1870, there's nothing for you. And you know, there are a lot of people who have great-grandparents who are alive who knew these people. So slavery to us isn't something that's so distant and past and foggy. For myself, I come from a family that's a mixture of white and Native American, the Creek Indians here in South Carolina and Georgia, and of black. And for my family, we're fortunate that our people were always free people of color, that I can find my family back to 1790. But for a whole lot of people, that doesn't exist. And when you look at, there are lots of families like my own who are pretty much white in appearance, but when you look at the legacy and you know that the things that went on these plantations, I'm not saying that there may not have been actual love and affection, but I don't think all of it was given, and maybe not all of it was taken. And I just think it's a terrible thing to suggest to black people that the best thing for them was slavery, the introduction to the white man. Because I think the basic issue of slavery is it was greed and money and avarice. And the white man seems to have a penchant for this. When you can look at the history of dealing with the Native Americans, they came and they took a whole country from a sovereign people because of greed. And so maybe, Brian, you should maybe do a show in the future, maybe on the social fabric of this country of people of color that were not slaves. And there were lots of free people of color in the South doing some extraordinary things. And, you know, maybe then we can begin to understand what actually was happening in this country at that time.
Thanks. You've seen some of these programs. This is the only, there was only one of 11 shows we've done so far that this very kind of call, both sides, all these calls we've been hearing about slavery, doesn't eventually become the discussion. Why do you think?
And it was heating up over this period, and with the Mexican War and all, you know, the expansion particularly. Would slavery extend or would it stop? And the real issue was not emancipation, it was stopping the spread of slavery into new areas. And some say it was political, some say it was otherwise. But the callers, of course, absolutely right about saying that anything was good for a race of people. And I will say, in terms of free black people in the South, it became harder and harder through the 1850s. There's quite a family in Nashville, Tennessee, who are architects. They're still in business. Still, the firm is still in business from the 1850s. And families that you find all through the South that were free and always were, or maybe always were, or at least were free during this time. In Washington, D.C., a number. But it became harder and harder in the South as laws, black codes and laws were made by the state legislatures to restrict them. A woman in Natchez, Mississippi, a slave-owning black woman, left a widow, was advised by her white lawyer to leave, and she did leave, and she went to South America, where the family presumably still lives.
As a lot of people in our audience know, Zachary Taylor didn't live very long. What was it, 16 months?
As president, yes. As
president, he's our next president, and then after that, Millard Fillmore took over, and we'll be featuring Millard Fillmore. I don't have my list. I think it's from East Aurora. Somebody can correct me if I'm wrong. New York. He was from outside. He's born.
East Aurora, and then died in Buffalo.
New York, and he's buried up there. Yeah, we will be at East Aurora. But during that program, a fellow by the name of Tony Cohen, who is an African American, will appear on the program and talk about the Underground Railroad. So that might be a point where we'll have some more discussion. I know we'll have more discussion about all this, and it might help put some of it in perspective. We go to Los Angeles next. Go ahead, please.
Good morning. I enjoy C-SPAN very much. I'm home with a bad back at the second, and so this is one of my favorite entertainments of the time of day. Long story short, I have two perspectives on this issue. First, I was very much enjoying the information on President Polk, and then this seemed to have degenerated into a issue of slavery. And I was I have two distinct points of view on the issue. One, my family originally was from an area of Alabama where they owned numerous slaves, and many of the people still work for the family in agriculture. And the point to the whole thing is, I can understand the previous callers' unhappiness with the issue, but I will say I have never, from any of my Southern relations, ever heard a negative term applied to a black person, ever. And I can also tell you that my great uncle was the sheriff of Mobile, Alabama, and actually was the U.S. Marshal for Mobile, Alabama, and had anyone tried to injure anyone else there, it would have been I wouldn't have wanted to have been the one being the one to do that. Also, I find it interesting that neither Jefferson Davis nor Robert E. Lee owned slaves, and that the Emancipation Proclamation didn't take effect in the North. And slavery was legal until, what, March, I think it was, of 1865 in the North? So, at any rate, I'm more interested in President Polk. Can we return to that?
But let me correct you on something. Both Lee and, they were actually probably in his wife's name, but Lee and Davis did own slaves, and Davis owned them in his own name and had a very extensive program for training them and putting away money that they earned toward their freedom. Very worked out system for this that Davis had.
John Holzapfel, the president's health, and we alluded to it earlier, and I know people kind of dance around this one because it's not a lot of fun to talk about, but he had an operation when he was 17. Can you tell us about it?
Exactly, and I thank the fifth grader, Lindsay from Iowa, for mentioning that. James K. Polk, just shortly before his 17th birthday, needed surgery, lithotomy, for stones in his urinary bladder. The nearest doctor who could perform surgery like that was a renowned doctor in Danville near Lexington, Kentucky, Dr. Ephraim McDowell. But it was an agonizing trip to get there. James Polk had the operation while awake with, as Lindsay mentioned, just either whiskey or brandy, the recovery, and then long trip back to Columbia. It wasn't perhaps a life-saving operation. James K. Polk felt well enough that he even sent Dr. McDowell a thank you note for all of that. But no doubt about it, James K. Polk's health improved in the short time, but he was such a diligent man, such a hard worker, and literally worked himself to exhaustion, that certainly affected his health. Sarah Polk was very concerned about her husband's work habits. During the White House years, she tried to make him promise that he'd leave his work at a certain time, leave the desk, and take a relaxing evening carriage ride through Washington with her. He wasn't very cooperative, but I think it's interesting, once when Sarah was ill, James was so concerned about her that he left a cabinet meeting several times to check on her, and when she started feeling better, he urged her to go along with him on a relaxing evening carriage ride through Washington.
Remember that James K. Polk was a one-term president. That's all he wanted to be, he said. And he had spent 14 years in the House of Representatives. He was Speaker of the House. His Secretary of the State went on to be President, James Buchanan. He was born in Mecklenburg County, North Carolina, which is right there where Charlotte, North Carolina is located, and the actual location is Pineville, North Carolina. He lived in this house we're sitting in. His parents owned it. He lived here for 6 years before he married Sarah Childress, who was 20 years old when they got married. He was 28. He also served as governor of the state of Tennessee for one term. And we go next to the city, which was named after his vice president, George Dallas, Texas. Good morning.
Good morning. I have a comment about the female caller earlier. She said that the Africans themselves had slaves. I don't think she understood, basically, slavery was the word given here in America. But in Africa, when one owed a debt to another family, it was a way of paying off that debt by working for that family. I don't think you could classify them as slaves, though, being owned by a family. It was only here in America, I think, where when Africans came here, they were then sold and owned by a family, but not in Africa.
Well, what about the fact that, we've talked about it so much here, the chiefs of the tribes and others in Africa selling their own citizens as slaves to Americans?
Hard, but I don't believe they really...
Who do you think, who paid for them? I mean, where did the money go? And I know this is a subject we could go on for a long time. It's a good subject to talk about, but how do you think they ever became slaves in the first place?
They, in service where their previous family member owed a debt.
Okay, thanks. Bill Steele, you want to comment?
Well, I mean, what you're talking about is similar to indentured servitude, and some scholars believe that the first black people who came to this country that we know about, at least in 1619, came as indentured servants and not slaves, that it was an indenture for a certain time to pay off God knows who, I guess whoever stole them. But I guess that's all scholarship I don't know about going on in Africa today, so I can't comment anymore.
Savannah, Georgia, about 7 minutes left. Go ahead, please.
Hello. Well, I was going to change the subject to the bladder stones, but Dr. Professor Holtz has told the story completely. I'll only add that the letter that was written to Ephraim McDowell showed the state of education of later to become President Polk, and he needed a little more instruction. As to the question of slavery, there's no question about its complexity and how bad it was, and we just have to come to grips with that.
All right, caller, thanks. Thank you for your call. Let's go on to Iowa City next. Go ahead, please. You're on the air.
Hello. On the question of slavery, I have a personal question. My family does link to, I am African American, and my family does link to Samuel Polk, and does indicate that we are descendant from Samuel, not from the president. One of the questions I have is whether Mr. Seal knows, whether Sarah Polk was a sister of James K. Polk. Sarah Polk married Congressman Kenneth Rayner, and I was trying to find a link there to find out where the Sarah Polk person is, as I have a great-grandmother named Sarah Polk Rayner who was African American, and I'm trying to find out the link in our genealogy.
Okay, thanks. Let me ask John Holzapfel about the sister.
I'm not aware of what the caller is talking about, but we'll do our best to try to find an answer for her. The Polk home is mainly a presidential historic site, and we don't have that much genealogical information. But every couple years, there's a Polk family reunion with Polks and Pollocks from all over the country getting together, and some of those folks are excellent genealogical researchers. I'll do what I can to try to forward the caller's question to them. She's welcome to send the question here to the James K. Polk home. She might not get an immediate answer, but we do keep a genealogical file of questions like that. And if we ever do get an answer, we'll certainly let her know.
Let me ask either one of you. First of all, if somebody wants to call here and they need information, what's the number here for them to call John Holzapfel?
Area code 931-388-2354. We also have an email address, jkpolk@usit.net.
On the shelf in the Library of Congress where they keep the 22 presidential papers back in the stacks, there's I think it's maybe a 40-volume group of diaries from James K. Polk. Have you ever seen those?
Oh, yeah. They're wonderful. And, you know, it's interesting. Recently, President Johnson's tapes have been published, and it's amazing the similarity, the sort of rhythm of the thinking and the labor, the constant one job after another, the getting in touch with this one, getting in touch with that one. The diaries, Johnson's tapes, reminded me so much of these diaries of James K. Polk. I recommend them to anyone who will dig through them and read. They're very interesting, almost a stream of consciousness.
Hamilton, Ohio. Go ahead, please.
Hi, Brian. How are you?
Fine. Welcome.
This is my very first time calling. I'm really nervous. I studied American presidency almost my whole life since I was 8. I'm 35 years old now. And I've just noticed the Polk show has been lost to slavery. And it's really I'm just really upset about that.
Wait a minute. Hold on. We've only talked about slavery for the last 30 minutes. This is a 2.5-hour program. We've covered the subject.
Half was pretty cool, but it's just like it got lost. Like you said, only about 11 shows, 10 have been mostly on slavery, and it's just you know, I'm against slavery, but I just want to get the show back on to President Polk, and So can you tell me President Polk's relationship with Franklin Pierce and how they interacted together? Because I know he tried to appoint Franklin Pierce Attorney General, but Franklin Pierce turned it down. And Brian, could you do the Franklin Pierce show? I'd like to see you narrate that because he's our most forgotten president. And also on Vice President Dallas, did he break the tie-breaking vote and he was almost ran out on a rail out of Pennsylvania? Could you comment on that, please? And I'll hang up and listen to your response. Thank you.
Either one of you can jump in on any of this.
Well, the Pierce party, of course, Pierce went to the war. He went to Mexico. So he didn't stay. He was wounded and came back a hero.
John Holzapfel, what about the Dallas tie-breaking?
That's right. As I mentioned in reference to David Wilmot, tariffs were very unpopular in industrial Pennsylvania, even among the Democrats, and Dallas was loyal to Pennsylvania, loyal to Polk rather than to his home state on that issue, and he took a lot of flack for it.
John Holzapfel, the grave. It's now up in Nashville, right there in the shadow of the Capitol. Why was he moved 3 times?
He died during a cholera epidemic. In fact, 150 years ago today, I might have mentioned, he was writing in his diary about cholera in Nashville. For fear of contagion, the city required cholera victims to be buried immediately and away from the downtown area where James K. Polk lived. So he and I think 32 other cholera victims were buried in the same cemetery.
Our American President series continues with a look at the nation's 11th president, James K. Polk. Earlier this year in our series, we visited the home of President Polk, located in Columbia, Tennessee, where we talked with historians William Seal and John Holzapfel about Polk's career and his impact on the United States. The program's 2.5 hours and begins with a brief video biography. James Knox Polk was considered by many to have been a dark horse when he was nominated for president in 1844, despite his political resume. Polk had served as governor of Tennessee from 1839 to 1841. Before that, he had been a member of the U.S. House of Representatives for 14 years. He's still the only president to have served as Speaker of the House. Nevertheless, a newspaper reported many were astonished by the news of his nomination, and some even wondered if the newly invented telegraph wasn't broken. The opposition Whig Party campaign slogan became, "Who is Polk?" He was born November 2nd, 1795, in Mecklenburg County, North Carolina, but moved with his family to Tennessee by the age of 10. He graduated with honors from the University of North Carolina in 1818 and went on to study law. He was nicknamed Young Hickory because of his staunch support of Andrew Jackson, Polk the Plotter for the conscientiousness he showed while Speaker, and Napoleon of the Stump because of his short stature. His hair was straight and combed back off his face, and he had deep-set, penetrating gray eyes. He was said to have lacked charisma and a sense of humor. He was also uncomfortable in social situations. At White House functions, guests were rushed past the president, and an aide would repeat continuously, "Guests who have been presented will please walk into the East Room. Don't block up the passage." His moderate consumption of alcohol prompted an enemy to once say his problem was that he drank too much water. He married the intelligent and refined Sarah Childress when he was 28 and she was 20. She was said to have enjoyed her social duties when Polk was a congressman, and even more so when he was elected president. A devout Presbyterian, she banned dancing and hard liquor at official White House functions. She was the first to host the now annual Thanksgiving dinner at the White House. She offered her husband advice on public policy and often highlighted newspaper articles for him to read. His inauguration